You're 15, there's a wedding tomorrow. Suddenly, four strangers walk in with a candle, a mirror, and a checklist. Congratulations, it's time to prove your purity. Or else, the scent of beeswax, cool stone, and aged parchment hung heavy in the air of the scriptorium. Sunlight, fractured by the high arched windows, cast dancing patterns of dust motes across the worn oak tables. Here, amidst the quiet industry of copying ancient texts, novice Elspeth found a fragile peace. Her days were a tapestry woven with prayer, study, and the meticulous work of illuminating manuscripts, a world far removed from the boisterous realities of the secular life she had left behind. Yet, even within these hallowed walls, the world outside, with its relentless anxieties, managed to intrude, whispering its secrets into the very stones of the abbey. It was during the quiet hours of Vespers, as the day drew to a close and the shadows lengthened, that Elspeth first heard them, the hushed conversations of the elder nuns. They gathered in small knots, their faces partially obscured by their wimples, their voices a low murmur that seemed to meld with the distant drone of plainsong. Elsbeth, polishing a tarnished silver reliquary near the cloister walk, found her attention snagged by the fragmented whispers. The words themselves were elusive, snatched away by the vastness of the stone halls, but the tone, the underlying current of shared experience, was unmistakable. It spoke of a familiar dread, a subterranean anxiety that seemed to grip the hearts of women regardless of their station or piety. And the mother was beside herself. One voice, dry and reedy like rustling leaves, confided, said the lad's father wouldn't hear of the union unless. The sentence trailed off, lost in a sigh. Another voice, deeper and resonating with a practiced gravity, replied, "The old ways die hard, sister, especially when it comes to the purity of the lineage. They speak of the old tests, the ones that leave no room for doubt, the ones that leave their mark." Elsbeth's heart gave a small, nervous lurch. She knew of what they spoke, or rather, she knew of the idea of it. Before entering the abbey, in the brief, turbulent time between girlhood and womanhood, she had heard the hushed, fearful tales from her own mother and the village women, stories that were never spoken aloud in the presence of men, tales of examinations, of rituals performed in secret, of pronouncements that could irrevocably alter a woman's destiny. The trials, as they were vaguely referred to, were a looming specter, an unspoken hurdle that all unmarried women were expected to somehow clear. "It is a heavy burden we carry, this reputation," the reedy voice continued, a note of resignation creeping in. "A stain on one's name can be as damning as any sin confessed, and so many innocent girls are caught in the web of rumor and suspicion, their futures decided by the breath of gossip." Elspeth imagined the scene. A young woman, perhaps no older than herself when she'd left home, her face pale with a fear she couldn't articulate. She saw her standing before elders, her fate hanging precariously on pronouncements made about her body, her very essence, the casual cruelty of it, the way a woman's worth was so inextricably tied to a physical manifestation, a state of being that was so easily questioned, so difficult to definitively prove. It was a paradox that had always unsettled her. The elder nuns spoke of the physical examinations, of the ways in which a woman's body was scrutinized, judged, and ultimately deemed worthy or unworthy. They spoke of the crude tools used, the unscientific methods that relied on assumption and conjecture. The very air in the cloister seemed to thicken with the unspoken anxieties of generations of women who had endured these intrusive assessments. It was not just the physical discomfort, but the profound emotional and psychological toll that these trials exacted. To have one's most intimate self laid bare, not for healing or comfort, but for judgment, was a violation that resonated deeply. And even those who have passed, a third nun added, her voice a low, somber hum, are never truly free. The whispers continue, a sideways glance, a word out of place, and the old doubts resurface. The mark of purity, once questioned, is never truly indelible in the eyes of the world. This was the insidious nature of it, Elsbeth realized. It wasn't just about a single event, a single examination. It was about a pervasive societal expectation, a constant vigilance demanded of women, a need to maintain an unblemished reputation that was constantly under threat. A woman's entire social standing, her eligibility for marriage, her integration into the community, all hinged on this fragile edifice of perceived purity, and the foundation of that edifice was constantly being tested by the winds of rumor and accusation. Even within the abbey, a place meant to be a sanctuary, these echoes of the secular world found their way. The nuns, despite their vows of chastity and their separation from the world of marriage and procreation, still carried the weight of these societal expectations. Their conversations, though veiled, were a testament to the deeply ingrained beliefs that permeated every stratum of medieval society, from the humblest village to the most austere religious institution. The anxiety surrounding female sexuality, the need to control and regulate it, was a powerful force, shaping lives and dictating destinies. Elsbeth found herself retreating into the solace of her work, her quill scratching softly against the parchment. The intricate patterns of the illuminated letters, the vibrant pigments she applied, offered a temporary escape from the unsettling realities hinted at in the nun's hushed tones. Yet, the words lingered, like the faint scent of incense after the candles have been extinguished. They spoke of a world where a woman's worth was measured by the absence of experience, where her body was a public document, subject to interpretation and judgment by others. It was a sobering thought, a stark reminder of the battles women fought, not always with swords and shields, but with whispers and rumors, with societal expectations and the deeply ingrained fear of impurity. The stone walls of the abbey, which she had once thought to be a shield against such anxieties, seemed instead to absorb and amplify them, turning the hushed whispers into a chorus that resonated with the unspoken fears of all women. Then, and perhaps even now, the loom of purity, as it seemed, wove its threads through every aspect of life, even within the seemingly serene confines of religious life. The midday sun beat down with a relentless warmth that did little to dry the persistent mud clinging to the cobblestones of Oakhaven's Market Square. It was a place of vibrant chaos, a symphony of bleating sheep, squawking chickens, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and the boisterous calls of vendors hawking their wares. Yet even amidst this lively din, a current of hushed urgency often found its way through the crowd, particularly when Agnes was present. Agnes, known throughout the surrounding hamlets as the village healer, was a woman carved from the very earth she tended. Her hands, permanently stained with the greens and browns of crushed leaves and roots, moved with a practiced dexterity that belied their rough appearance. They were hands that had coaxed life from stubborn soil, that had soothed fevers with cool poultices, and now hands that were being sought by a desperate mother. The woman, her face etched with a worry that seemed to have settled permanently around her eyes, approached Agnes's makeshift stall with a hesitant step. Her simple wool dress was clean, but the slight tremor in her hands spoke of a deeper disquiet. She clutched a small, roughly woven basket filled with a few pale onions and a handful of overripe apples, meager offerings for the sought after remedy. Agnes, she began, her voice barely a whisper above the market's clamor. They say, they say your skill is unmatched, my Alara. Agnes, who had been carefully arranging a collection of dried marigold petals, her brow furrowed in concentration, looked up. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive, seemed to take in the woman's distress in a single glance. Ilara, the baker's daughter. Agnes's voice was gruff, yet not unkind. She recognized the mother, a woman named Martha, whose daughter had recently come of age, a transition often fraught with anxieties for both the girl and her family. Martha nodded, her gaze darting nervously around as if fearing to be overheard. Yes, Agnes, deemed Ilara. There have been whispers. You know how it is. She wrung her hands, the gesture amplifying her distress. Her father, he's a hard man. He demands proof. They say, they say there's a way you can know, a way to be sure. Agnes set down the marigolds, her expression unreadable. She knew the whispers Martha referred to. In Oak Haven, as in countless villages across the land, a young woman's reputation was a fragile thing, easily tarnished. And for a daughter destined for a good match, or even just to maintain the family's standing, any hint of impropriety before marriage was a cause for grave concern. The test Martha spoke of was not a formal, legal proceeding, but a deeply personal and often superstitious ritual entrusted to women like Agnes, who possessed a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge rooted in the earth and its potent secrets. Come, Agnes said, her voice a low rumble, beckoning Martha to the back of her stall, a small alcove shielded from the direct gaze of the marketplace. Here, the scents of the square were replaced by a more concentrated, earthy aroma. Dried bundles of lavender hung from a rough wooden beam, their fragrance a calming balm. Jars of various sizes, filled with powders, tinctures, and preserved herbs, lined a series of weathered shelves. Twisted roots, their shapes suggestive of ancient sigils, lay beside shimmering dried flowers and potent-smelling barks. This was Agnes's apothecary, a sanctuary of natural remedies, and it was believed by many a place where the hidden truths of a woman's body could be revealed. Martha followed, her apprehension palpable. She placed the basket of meager offerings on a rough-hewn wooden counter. Agnes picked up the onions, turning them over in her calloused hands. These will not suffice, Martha, she said, her tone firm. This is not a matter for the ordinary. It requires specific ingredients. She then looked directly at Martha, and it requires a willingness to accept what is revealed. Martha swallowed, her throat visibly working. I will pay what I can, Agnes. Anything. Alara's future depends on this. Her father, he will not forgive a stain on their name. Agnes surveyed the collection of herbs and roots spread before her. Her knowledge was a legacy passed down from her own grandmother, a woman who had lived by the rhythms of the seasons and the wisdom of the plants. She understood the power held within these dried leaves and gnarled roots, a power often misunderstood and sometimes feared by the more superstitious villagers. She knew that these remedies were not always about curing illness, but often about addressing anxieties, about providing a semblance of control in a world where much was left to chance and the pronouncements of men. The test you seek, Agnes began, her gaze drifting towards a small, dark pouch hanging from a hook, is not one that can be performed with a simple brew. It requires a deeper understanding, a careful preparation. It is about what is held within the body and what the body reveals when subjected to certain influences. She reached for the dark pouch, its contents rustling softly. It contained a finely ground powder, a mixture of rare herbs known for their supposed properties of purification and discernment. She began to measure out small quantities of various ingredients, her movements deliberate and precise. There was wormwood, its bitterness legendary, said to purge the body of impurities. There were the dried petals of the moonflower, blooming only at night, believed to hold secrets that the sun concealed. And there was the root of the mandrake, its forked shape mirroring the human form, a powerful and often dangerous ingredient, whispered to possess an uncanny ability to reveal hidden truths. These were not the simple remedies for coughs or fevers that most villagers sought from Agnes. These were concoctions for matters of the soul, for the intangible essence of a woman's virtue, matters steeped in the deeply ingrained beliefs of the time. Agnes explained the process, her words woven with a blend of practical instruction and almost ritualistic pronouncements. The daughter must drink this mixture at the turning of the moon, she stated, carefully measuring a dark, viscous liquid into a small clay pot. It is not pleasant, the taste. It will make her stomach churn, her mind reel. It is meant to stir what lies within, to bring forth what has been hidden. She paused, her eyes meeting Martha's. She must then wait. The herbs will work their magic, or they will not. But their true purpose is to prepare her body, to make it receptive to what is to come. The what is to come was the next and most crucial part of the test, a part that Agnes seldom articulated explicitly, for it was the part shrouded in the most mystery and, frankly, the most unscientific conjecture. It involved a visual examination conducted by the elders of the village, or more commonly, by the prospective husband or his family. The logic, however flawed, was that the herbs would somehow cleanse or reveal a physical sign, a confirmation of purity. Agnes, a woman of practical knowledge, knew that the effectiveness of her poultices was often debated, and their results frequently interpreted through the lens of pre-existing beliefs and biases. She must be prepared for discomfort, Agnes continued, her tone shifting to one of grave warning. These are potent things, not for the faint of heart. The mother's anxiety can be a potent force too, Martha. It can cloud judgment, both hers and yours. Agnes then proceeded to mix a second, more solid preparation. This was a thick paste, a dark green slurry of crushed leaves and roots bound together with honey and a touch of dew collected from spider webs at dawn, an ingredient considered particularly potent for its supposed ability to trap and reveal subtle essences. She carefully scooped the poultice into a small linen square, tying it with a string of sinew. This, she said, handing it to Martha, is to be applied to her abdomen, directly over her womb. The warmth will seep in, and it is said to draw out any hidden imbalances. The very concept of such a remedy, relying as it did on a mixture of superstition and a rudimentary understanding of the body, was a testament to the era. Without the sophisticated medical knowledge of later centuries, and often without the benefit of scientific inquiry, people turned to traditional healers and their earthy remedies. These were often a desperate blend of genuine herbal efficacy for certain ailments and deeply ingrained folk beliefs that filled the voids left by ignorance. The purity Agnes was attempting to assess was a social and moral construct, not a purely biological one, and her remedies were meant to satisfy the societal demand for proof, even if that proof was based on conjecture and ritual. Martha accepted the linen wrapped poultice with trembling hands. The fabric felt cool and damp against her skin, and the scent of the herbs was strong, a primal earthy aroma that spoke of hidden processes. And and when will she know, Agnes? She asked, her voice a fragile thread. When will the truth be known? Agnes turned back to her stall, her movements regaining their rhythm as she resumed sorting through dried herbs. The truth, Martha, she said, her voice echoing with a profound, almost weary wisdom, is rarely as simple as a single test. The herbs will do what they can, but ultimately it is in the eyes of those who look for it, and in the stories they choose to believe, that the final judgment will be made. She offered Martha a small, dried sprig of rosemary. For strength, she said, she will need it. As Martha turned to leave, a group of younger women passed by Agnes's stall, their laughter ringing out. They glanced at Martha with a mixture of curiosity and perhaps a touch of pity, their own faces unburdened by the immediate anxieties that weighed so heavily on the baker's wife. But Agnes knew that for them too, the future held its own unspoken trials. The loom of purity, as Elspeth had mused within the quiet abbey walls, cast its long, intricate threads through every corner of life, and Agnes, with her weathered hands and earthy wisdom, was one of the many weavers tasked with its complex, often unsettling design. She watched Martha disappear into the throng, a solitary figure carrying a bundle of hope and fear, a testament to the enduring societal pressures that shaped the lives of women, even in the heart of a bustling market. Agnes, in her own way, was merely a tool, a dispenser of traditional remedies, and more importantly, of a manufactured certainty in a world that often offered little else to women whose virtue was their most prized and most vulnerable possession. The unscientific nature of her concoctions, the reliance on superstition and interpretation, did not negate their significance. Indeed, it was often the very ambiguity, the very ritualistic nature of the test, that provided the sought after, albeit illusory, confirmation. The market, for all its noise and commerce, was also a stage for these deeply personal dramas, and Agnes, the village healer, played her part with a quiet authority, her remedies a testament to the complex interplay of tradition, fear, and the enduring quest for societal validation. The faint, musty scent of dried herbs and something sharper, metallic, pricked at Isolde's senses. It was the smell of the barber surgeon's rooms, a place she had always associated with the unpleasant necessity of bloodletting and tooth pulling. Now it was the arena for a far more terrifying ordeal. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with a single narrow window allowing only a grudging sliver of the late afternoon sun to penetrate the gloom. The light, weak and watery, cast long, distorted shadows across the rough stone floor. Isolde sat on a low stool, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Each breath she drew felt shallow, insufficient, as if the very air had been thinned by the weight of her dread. Across from her, Seated on a sturdier, high backed chair was Master Boren, the village barber surgeon. His face was a landscape of leathery wrinkles, his eyes small and beady, like a bird's, peering out from beneath bushy gray brows. His hands, thick and calloused, lay folded on his lap, but Isolde knew those hands. She had seen them grip a razor with a surgeon's steady hand and a poultice with surprising gentleness. Today, however, those hands were to be instruments of judgment, instruments that would, if the whispers were to be believed, reveal the innermost secrets of her body, secrets that were not truly hers to possess or to guard, but belonged to the man who claimed her future, Sir Calin. The name itself was a bell tolling in her mind. Her betrothed, the knight who had ridden away, clad in shining armor, to fight for God and King in distant lands, had returned. He had returned, not with tales of glorious victory alone, but with a demand that gnawed at the very fabric of her being. He wanted proof, proof of her virtue, proof of her purity, proof that she had remained untouched and untainted during his long absence. It was an absurd, cruel expectation. How could she prove something that was, by its very nature, an absence of experience? It was like asking a locked door to prove it had never been opened. Yet here she was, subjected to this humiliating ritual, all because Calin, the chivalrous knight, had become Calin, the demanding lord, his trust a fragile commodity, easily shattered by the winds of suspicion. Her mind, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of circumstance, flitted through the recent weeks. The hushed conversations among the women of the household, the worried glances exchanged between her mother and the servants, the veiled insinuations of the older women who had seen too many young lives blighted by unproven accusations. And then the pronouncement from Calin himself, delivered with a cold finality that left no room for argument. He had spoken of honor, of his own reputation, of the lineage he intended to forge. He had not spoken of love or of trust. Isolde swallowed, her throat dry. She dared not meet Master Boren's gaze, preferring to fix her eyes on a stain on the floor, a dark, irregular patch that seemed to mirror the disquiet in her soul. The very air felt heavy, charged with unspoken expectations. She was a pawn on a grand chessboard, her virtue the prize of a game played by men whose rules she did not understand and could not change. Master Boren cleared his throat, a rasping sound that made Isolde flinch. Lady Isolde, he began, his voice surprisingly gentle, though lacking any real warmth. Sir Calin has entrusted me with a delicate task. He seeks reassurance. Reassurance. The words felt like a mockery. What reassurance could this grim proceeding offer? Isolde's own mother had arranged this meeting, her face a mask of anxious resignation. She had done her best to prepare Isolde, speaking in hushed tones of the herbs to be used, the procedure to be followed, but no amount of preparation could truly shield her from the profound sense of violation that was beginning to creep in. He believes in my loyalty, Master Boren, Isolde managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a betraying tide of shame for speaking of such intimate matters to a stranger. Master Boren's lips twitched, a faint, almost imperceptible movement that might have been a smile or merely a tightening of his facial muscles. Belief is a comfort, my lady, he said, his tone measured, but Sir Calin, as a man of action, requires certainty. The ritual is simple, and it is discreet. It is designed to reveal nothing that is not already there. But what if what is already there is not what he expects? The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. What if my own body betrays me, not through any fault of my own, but simply by its natural state? The fear was irrational, she knew. The tales whispered in hushed tones spoke of signs, of subtle changes that the herbs and poultices were meant to elicit. But the specifics remained shrouded in mystery, the details as elusive as a dream upon waking. Her mind drifted back to the abbey, to the quiet solitude of the cloister, to the teachings of the nuns. They had spoken of inner purity, of the soul's devotion. They had not spoken of physical proofs, of such invasive examinations. Had Elspeth, in her quiet contemplation, ever imagined a world where a woman's worth was measured by the secretions of her body, interpreted by the hand of a barber surgeon? Master Boren rose from his chair, moving with a slow, deliberate gait. He opened a small wooden chest, revealing a collection of vials and small, intricately carved stone vessels. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as he began to prepare the concoctions. Isolde watched him, her gaze drawn to the faint tremor in her own hands, a tremor she tried desperately to control. She was a lady, betrothed to a knight. She should be composed, regal, untouched by such base concerns. But the reality was a suffocating fear, a primal terror of being judged, of being found wanting by standards that felt alien and unjust. He selected a small, unglazed clay cup and a darkened vial. From the vial, he poured a thick, dark liquid into the cup. The scent that rose from it was sharp, acrid, with an undercurrent of something strangely earthy, like damp soil after a storm. This, Master Boren said, holding the cup out to her, is a cleansing draught. It is made from a blend of bitter herbs, carefully prepared. It will settle your stomach and prepare you. He paused, his small eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There may be a slight discomfort, a feeling of inner heat, perhaps. It is to be expected. The herbs work to purify. Isolde hesitated, her hand reaching out with agonizing slowness. The clay cup felt cool against her fingertips, a stark contrast to the heat that seemed to be radiating from within her own skin. She raised the cup to her lips, her heart hammering against her ribs. The liquid was foul, intensely bitter, coating her tongue with a taste that lingered like a bad memory. She forced herself to swallow, each gulp an act of sheer will. As the draught coursed through her, a wave of nausea washed over her. Her stomach churned, and a faint dizziness settled in her head. It was as if her body was protesting this forced intrusion, this violation of its natural rhythm. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on the teachings of the nuns, on the quiet strength they had embodied. But the image of Kalen's stern, unyielding face intruded, a constant reminder of the judgment she faced. Master Boren watched her, his expression unreadable. He then moved to a small, rough-spun linen bag filled with a dark, powdery substance. He scooped out a portion of the powder and began to mix it with a few drops of water on a flat stone, creating a thick, greenish paste. This, he explained, his voice low, is a poultice. It contains ground willow bark for its soothing properties and a touch of vervain, which is said to reveal that which is hidden. This is to be applied externally. He carefully placed the paste into a fresh linen square and tied it with a thin strip of leather. He held it out to Isolde. You will apply this yourself, my lady, to your lower abdomen. It is a gentle warmth, a drawing in of any lingering impurities. Isolde took the poultice, the linen cool and slightly damp against her skin. The earthy scent of the herbs was stronger now, mingling with the acrid tang of the draught she had just consumed. She felt a profound sense of helplessness. This was her body, her private sanctuary, being subjected to rituals dictated by the whims and suspicions of a man who had been absent for so long that she barely recognized him. Her internal monologue was a torrent of despair. What if the herbs do not work as intended? What if they react poorly with my humors? What if the impurities they speak of are merely the natural workings of a woman's body, and he will see them as a stain upon my honor? The arbitrary nature of it all was the most terrifying aspect. There was no science, no certainty, only the interpretation of a man whose knowledge was limited and whose judgment was already clouded by suspicion. She imagined Calin, back from the Crusades, his armor gleaming, his eyes hard. He had seen battles, he had seen death, he had seen the harsh realities of the world. Had that hardened him? Had it made him incapable of simple trust? Or was this demand for proof a reflection of the societal pressures that weighed upon all men of his standing, the constant need to ensure lineage, to maintain purity within the bloodlines? The silence in the room stretched, broken only by the distant sounds of the village outside, a dog barking, the faint murmur of voices. Each sound seemed to emphasize Isolde's isolation, her confinement within this small, dimly lit space, her entrapment within the expectations of her sex. Master Boren, sensing her hesitation, spoke again. "It is a simple matter, my lady, a formality. Sir Calin desires peace of mind, and you, surely, desire to meet his expectations." Desire, the word felt hollow. What she desired was to be trusted, to be loved, to be accepted for who she was, not for some abstract, unproven concept of purity. But those were desires that seemed to belong to a different world, a world of gentle understanding, not of stark pronouncements and invasive rituals. With trembling fingers, Isolde reached down, her movements stiff and awkward. She adjusted her skirts, revealing a portion of her abdomen. The skin felt unnaturally cold. She pressed the poultice against her skin, the warmth of the paste slowly beginning to seep through the linen. It was a strange sensation, an intimate act performed under the gaze of a stranger. She imagined Calin waiting, perhaps even now at his manor, impatient for the surgeon's report. What would he do if the report was anything less than a complete exoneration? Would he cast her aside? Would her family be shamed? The weight of those possibilities pressed down on her, threatening to crush her spirit. Her mind flashed to her mother, a woman who had always strived for propriety, for respectability. How much had she sacrificed to ensure Isolde's advantageous marriage? Had she, too, felt the pressure of these expectations, these rituals of feminine virtue? The thought brought a pang of sympathy, a shared understanding of the burdens placed upon women. The ritual, as described by Master Boren, was simple enough in its execution, yet profoundly complex in its implications. It was a symbolic act, a tangible manifestation of an intangible virtue, a societal demand reduced to a physical examination. Agnes, the village healer, might have possessed a deeper, more intuitive understanding of the body's secrets, a knowledge passed down through generations. But Master Boren, with his rudimentary tools and his limited understanding, was the chosen instrument of Calin's demand. His rudimentary knowledge was, in essence, the only knowledge deemed acceptable by the man who held her future in his hands. Isolde felt a prickling sensation on her skin where the poultice was applied. Was it the herbs working their magic, or merely the anxiety manifesting itself in physical discomfort? The ambiguity was maddening. She longed for a definitive answer, a clear sign, anything that would dispel the suffocating uncertainty. But this was not a world of clear answers, especially not for women. She thought of the nun, Elsbeth, and her contemplation of the loom of purity. Isolde now understood, with a chilling clarity, the intricate, often painful threads that wove through a woman's life. Her own thread felt impossibly fragile, vulnerable to the slightest snag, the slightest unraveling. Master Boren approached her again, his gaze now focused on the poultice. He reached out a finger, almost touching the linen, then drew back. "It is done, my lady," he said, his voice neutral. "You may remove it after a short while. I will attend to the rest." Attend to the rest. What did that mean? Would he examine the poultice for some arcane sign? Would he consult some ancient dusty tome to interpret the subtle changes? Isolde's mind reeled at the possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. She was a woman of breeding, of education, yet she felt utterly powerless, reduced to a passive object in a ceremony that stripped away her dignity and her autonomy. She looked at Master Boren, a man whose profession was to mend the body, but who was now being asked to arbitrate the virtue of a woman. His knowledge, rooted in the practicalities of healing, was being co opted to serve the demands of patriarchal expectation. He was, in his own way, a product of this system, a cog in the machine that measured and policed feminine purity. As Isolde rose from the stool, her legs felt unsteady. The room seemed to spin slightly, the shadows deepening as the light outside continued to fade. She felt a profound weariness, not just physical, but spiritual. The ordeal, though brief, had extracted a heavy toll. She left Master Boren's rooms, stepping out into the cool evening air. The familiar path back to her family's modest estate felt alien, as if the world outside had shifted subtly, tainted by the ritual she had just undergone. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth filled her nostrils, a comforting contrast to the sterile medicinal smells of the surgeon's rooms. Yet even these familiar scents did not entirely dispel the lingering unease. She knew that the true test was yet to come. The report from Master Boren, delivered to Sir Kalen, would be the final verdict. And in that verdict, Isolde knew, would lie not just the fate of her betrothal, but the judgment of her worth as a woman, a judgment shaped by the arbitrary demands of men and the deeply ingrained beliefs of their society. The loom of purity, cast by the hands of Sir Kalen, would continue to weave its intricate, unforgiving pattern through her life, and she could only pray that the threads she had been given, the threads of her own body and spirit, would somehow hold against the relentless, judgmental gaze of the world. The knight's vow, made on distant battlefields, had returned to demand a maiden's fear, a fear that was as potent and as pervasive as the ancient traditions that bound them all. The air in the village market square, usually alive with the cheerful din of commerce and gossip, seemed to hum with a different kind of energy today. It was the low thrum of unspoken judgments, the silent observance that followed women who dared to step outside the meticulously woven boundaries of propriety. Isolde, walking with her mother towards the church, felt it like a tangible weight, a gaze that seemed to penetrate the very fabric of her gown. It was the consequence of the barber surgeon's pronouncement, the hushed whispers that had inevitably followed. Sir Callan had received his reassurance, a discreet report delivered by Master Boren, a report that, while confirming Isolde's outward compliance with the ritual, did little to quell the undercurrent of suspicion that had now been irrevocably sown. The weight of that scrutiny was a constant, suffocating presence. It was the unwritten ordinance, the bedrock upon which a woman's reputation, and indeed her very survival, was built. This wasn't a decree etched in parchment and read aloud. It was a far more insidious form of law, ingrained in the very bones of society, passed down through generations of mothers to daughters and fathers to sons. It dictated that a woman's worth, her market value, was inextricably linked to her perceived sexual history, or more precisely, the absence of one. Chastity was not merely a virtue, it was a commodity, a guarantee of lineage, a shield against the shame of illegitimacy that could tarnish an entire family's standing. Even as a child, Isolde had absorbed these lessons, not through direct instruction, but through the osmosis of daily life. She had seen the averted eyes of women whose reputations had been tarnished by careless whispers or outright accusations. She had heard the sharp, critical tones of older women dissecting the perceived flaws of younger ones, their words laced with a venom born of their own lived experiences and the societal pressures they too had endured. The ideal was a flawless, unblemished vessel, a prize to be presented to a worthy husband, its perfection a reflection of his own discernment and the purity of his lineage. The church, a sanctuary for many, felt like another arena for this silent judgment. The familiar scent of incense and beeswax did little to soothe Isolde's frayed nerves. As she knelt beside her mother, her gaze fell upon the elaborate stained glass window depicting Saint Agnes, the patron saint of virgins. Agnes, young and resolute, stood serene amidst the symbols of her martyrdom, her purity an unassailable fortress. But for Isolde, the image now seemed less a beacon of divine protection and more a symbol of an almost unattainable ideal. How could one's inner state, one's very essence, be so neatly encapsulated and judged by external pronouncements, by the interpretations of those who held power? The religious justifications for this unwavering focus on female chastity were deeply embedded. Sermons often invoked the sanctity of marriage, framing the woman's body as a sacred trust, a vessel to be preserved for the sole purpose of procreation within that sacred union. Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden was a constant, albeit often unstated, reminder of the perceived inherent weakness and susceptibility of womankind to temptation. This theological scaffolding provided a potent, divinely sanctioned rationale for the pervasive scrutiny and control exercised over women's lives. A woman's virtue was not just a matter of social standing, it was a matter of spiritual purity, a reflection of her adherence to God's will, or so the narrative went. Her mother, sensing Isolde's disquiet, reached out a hand, her touch a gentle pressure on Isolde's arm. "Courage, child," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the rustle of prayer books. Lady Eleanor, too, had lived under this unwritten ordinance. Her own marriage to Isolde's father had been a strategic alliance, a testament to the careful management of family fortunes and reputations. She understood the precariousness of a woman's position, the constant need to maintain a facade of unwavering virtue, even when faced with suspicion or the mere implication of transgression. The shame, Isolde realized, was not just hers, it was a shared burden, a collective inheritance of womanhood in this age. It was the understanding that her own body, the very vessel of her existence, was not entirely her own to command, but was in fact a public spectacle, subject to the interpretations and pronouncements of others. The barber surgeon's examination, while ostensibly about confirming her status for Sir Calin, had also served as a public unveiling, a moment where the intimate realities of her physical being were rendered subject to external decree. The whispers, though faint, were persistent. They spoke of Kalen's renewed vigor, his returning confidence, and the swiftness with which he had sought to secure his lineage. There was a subtle implication that his quest for confirmation was not born of a lack of faith, but of a diligent responsibility to his noble house. This narrative, carefully constructed by those who benefited from maintaining the existing social order, served to absolve his actions, framing them as prudent and necessary rather than as an infringement on Isolde's personal dignity. The internalized nature of these codes was perhaps the most insidious aspect. Men, too, were shaped by these expectations. Their honor, their manhood, was often tied to their ability to command and control women, to ensure the purity of their wives and daughters. A man who could not guarantee the virtue of his female kin was seen as weak, his authority undermined. This created a vicious cycle where the enforcement of these codes was perpetuated by both men and women, each acting within the confines of a system that offered them defined roles and expectations, however constricting. Isolde's own internal monologue was a testament to this internalization. She found herself, despite her resentment, replaying the events of the past weeks, searching for any misstep, any perceived lapse in her conduct that might have fueled Kalen's suspicion. Had she been too friendly with the stable boy? Had her laughter been too loud at the harvest feast? These were the questions that gnawed at her, the self-imposed interrogation that followed the external judgment. The very act of being subjected to the examination, regardless of its outcome, had planted a seed of doubt, a constant internal questioning of her own blamelessness. The ritual itself, a blend of herbal remedies and external applications, was a physical manifestation of this societal obsession. The belief that certain concoctions could reveal or confirm a woman's purity was rooted in ancient traditions, a fusion of folk medicine and religious dogma. The bitter draught, the soothing poultice, these were not merely treatments, but symbolic acts designed to elicit a tangible response that could be interpreted as proof. The very language used by Master Borin, speaking of settling the stomach and purifying, echoed the broader societal narrative of cleansing and renewal, a purification that was for women almost exclusively linked to their sexual history. The days that followed were a quiet agony. The betrothal remained, the wedding date set, but the shadow of the ordeal lingered. Isolde found herself scrutinizing her own reflection with a new, critical eye, searching for any subtle changes, any outward sign that might betray the findings of Master Borin's examination. It was a futile exercise, she knew, but the deeply ingrained nature of the unwritten ordinance made it impossible to simply dismiss. Her body, her most private self, had been rendered a subject of public discourse, and the echoes of that discourse resonated within her own mind. The elders of the village, women who had weathered generations of these expectations, offered a mixture of sympathy and unspoken advice. They spoke of the importance of pleasing one's husband, of maintaining harmony within the household, of the quiet resilience required of women. Their words, though intended to offer comfort, often served to reinforce the very codes Isolde found so oppressive. They were, in their own way, custodians of this unwritten law, their lived experience a testament to its enduring power. The weight of the unwritten ordinance was not merely a matter of social decorum, it was a matter of survival. A woman's reputation was her shield, her armor. Without it, she was vulnerable to ostracism, to poverty, to a life of hardship and marginalization. The rigorous adherence to these codes, the constant vigilance, was therefore not a choice, but a necessity. It was a societal contract, signed not with ink and quill, but with the lived realities of women's lives, a contract that demanded a perpetual performance of purity and deference. Isolde understood, with a chilling clarity, that her own journey through womanhood would be shaped by these invisible yet unyielding threads woven into the very fabric of her existence from the moment she was born. The ritual was over, but the judgment, the constant unspoken ordinance, had only just begun. The weight of expectation, once acknowledged, settled into Isolde's bones with the chilling finality of a winter frost. The pronouncements of the barber surgeon, the subtle nods of approval from her mother, the polite yet knowing glances from the village elders. These were all merely the visible tremors of a far more profound earthquake rumbling beneath the surface of her life. It was the earthquake of reputation, a force so potent it could shatter a woman's world with the mere tremor of a rumor. In Etheria, as in any tightly woven community of the medieval era, a woman's worth was not measured by her wit, her skill, or her kindness, but by the unblemished tapestry of her perceived virtue. This tapestry, however, was woven from threads so delicate that the slightest breath of suspicion could unravel it entirely. Isolde had learned this truth not through harsh pronouncements, but through the quiet observation of countless lives around her. She'd seen Ilara, the baker's daughter, once admired for her rosy cheeks and hearty laughter, become a pariah after a whispered accusation of a tryst with a traveling merchant. The merchant had moved on, his name forgotten, but Ilara's shame clung to her like a shroud. Her father's business suffered, and the villagers who once eagerly bought her father's loaves now averted their gaze, their silence a deafening condemnation. Ilara's future, once bright with the prospect of a respectable marriage, had been irrevocably dimmed. Then there was old Agnes, whose son had been the talk of the village years ago for his quick temper and his wandering eye. Agnes, a widow who had always been a pillar of the community, found herself increasingly excluded. Her sin by association was to have raised a son who had dared to express an interest in a maiden not yet betrothed. The whisper had been that the boy, Thomas, had been caught lingering too long outside Agnes's neighbor's cottage, a cottage whose daughter was of marriageable age. There was no proof, no witnessing, only the phantom whisper of a furtive glance exchanged, a hurried departure that spoke volumes to the watchful eyes of Etheria. Agnes's own reputation, built over decades of hard work and community service, began to fray. Doors that had always been open now remained closed. Invitations to gatherings ceased. The village, in its collective judgment, deemed her tainted by her son's transgression, as if sin could be inherited, passed down like a familial illness. Isolde understood that a woman's reputation was a fragile currency, easily debased by the careless minting of gossip. It was a currency that dictated her access to social circles, her marriage prospects, and even her ability to earn a livelihood should widowhood or misfortune befall her. The events of the past weeks, the barber surgeon's visit, had been a public spectacle disguised as a private necessity, while the immediate crisis had been averted, or so Kalen believed. The seeds of doubt had been sown, watered by the very act of suspicion itself. The incident with the stable boy, young Finn, though seemingly insignificant in Isolde's own mind, now loomed large in the collective consciousness of Etheria. It had been a moment of shared laughter, a fleeting exchange of pleasantries as she passed through the stables. Finn, a boy of 17 with a shy smile and sun-bleached hair, had been mucking out the stalls. Isolde, returning from a walk in the woods, had paused to ask about her mare's temperament. Their conversation had been no more than a dozen sentences, polite and unremarkable, yet someone somewhere had seen it. Someone had observed Finn's slight blush as he met her gaze, Isolde's own smile as she returned his respectful greeting. And from that innocuous exchange, a narrative had been spun, a dark thread woven into the bright fabric of her reputation. The whispers, Isolde knew, had begun subtly. A raised eyebrow from the seamstress, a pointed silence from the baker's wife when Isolde's mother passed by. Then came the bolder pronouncements, spoken in hushed tones behind cupped hands in the market square. Did you see her speaking to Finn the other day? So close they were. He looked quite taken with her, didn't he, for a woman of her station to be seen chatting so freely with a stable hand? The implication was clear, the moral drawn inevitable. A woman who spoke so freely with a man of lower standing, who allowed herself even a moment of unguarded warmth, was undoubtedly paving the way for greater transgressions. This perception was not rooted in logic, but in the deeply ingrained societal belief that women were inherently susceptible to temptation, their virtue a precarious shield that required constant reinforcement and vigilant protection. A man's honor, it was believed, was intrinsically linked to the purity of the women in his life, his wife, his daughters, his sisters. Any perceived lapse in their conduct reflected poorly upon him, diminishing his standing, his authority, his very manhood. Kalen, in seeking the barber surgeon's assurance, had been not only securing his lineage, but also preemptively defending his honor against any potential stain that could arise from Isolde's imagined indiscretions. The irony was that Isolde had always strived to be the model of maidenly decorum. She was dutiful, respectful, and acutely aware of the boundaries that defined her existence. Yet the very act of being noticed, of being observed, seemed to make her a target. The stable boy incident, a simple moment of human connection, had been twisted into a transgression, a testament to her supposed flightiness. It was as if her very breath was a potential accusation. The consequences were swift and brutal. Invitations to gatherings, which had once been regular, began to dwindle. While the formal betrothal to Sir Kalen still stood, the informal social engagements that cemented alliances and fostered goodwill began to exclude Isolde. The ladies of the village, who had previously welcomed her into their circles, now offered polite but distant nods. Their conversations, which had once included her, now ceased abruptly when she approached, only to resume with a subtle shift in topic, leaving Isolde to wonder what had been said, what judgment had been passed. Lady Eleanor, Isolde's mother, noticed the shift with a growing unease. She had witnessed similar social ostracism befall other women and understood the insidious nature of such subtle ostracism. She tried to shield Isolde, to maintain a brave face, but the tightening circle of their social world was undeniable. Her attempts to arrange meetings with families of good standing were met with polite refusals, citing prior commitments or sudden travel plans. These were not genuine reasons, but veiled rejections, the unspoken message echoing the whispers in the market square. Isolde's reputation was now tainted, and association with her carried a risk. Isolde herself felt the corrosive effects of this social isolation. The once familiar faces in the village now seemed to hold a collective indictment. She began to dread venturing out. The market square, once a place of vibrant activity, now felt like a gauntlet. Every glance felt like a scrutiny, every averted gaze a silent condemnation. She found herself meticulously replaying every interaction, every word, searching for the precise moment when innocence had been twisted into suspicion. Was it the way she had smiled at Finn? Had she stood too close? Had her laughter been too loud, too uninhibited? The self doubt was a relentless torment, a constant internal echo of the external judgment. The elders of the village, particularly the older women, were often the most fervent enforcers of these unwritten laws. They had spent their lives adhering to them, their own reputations meticulously curated through years of unwavering conformity. They saw it as their duty to uphold the moral fabric of Etheria, and any deviation, no matter how small, was a threat to the entire community. Isolde's mother, Lady Eleanor, found herself facing subtle rebukes from these matriarchs. "It is a shame, my lady, that your daughter seems to lack a proper understanding of the boundaries expected of a woman of her station," one might remark, her words dripping with faux sympathy. Another might offer unsolicited advice. "A firm hand is needed, my lady. Young girls today have so little respect for tradition. One must ensure they understand that a misplaced word, a fleeting glance, can bring ruin." These comments, veiled as concern, were calculated barbs designed to wound and to reinforce the perceived transgression. They were a constant reminder that even with the barber surgeon's pronouncement, the stain of suspicion remained, a mark that no amount of external reassurance could fully erase. The whispers, once a mere nuisance, had become a weapon capable of dismantling a life's work of careful cultivation. The weight of this social condemnation was not merely emotional, it had tangible consequences. Isolde's younger sister, Clara, who was yet a child, began to be treated differently by her playmates. Girls who had once shared their secrets and games with Clara now whispered amongst themselves when she approached, their mother's warnings clearly evident in their behavior. Clara, too young to fully comprehend the injustice, felt the sting of exclusion, the confusion of being ostracized for a crime she had not committed. This realization that her family's name was being tarnished and that her own sister was suffering the repercussions fueled Isolde's resentment towards the rigid, unforgiving societal structure. The church, usually a source of solace, now amplified Isolde's unease. The sermons, which often spoke of divine forgiveness and boundless love, seemed to hold a hidden caveat. This forgiveness was contingent upon a woman's unwavering adherence to the prescribed path. The parable of the prodigal son, so often invoked to illustrate God's grace, was for women subtly reinterpreted to emphasize the original sin, the fall from grace that necessitated such a desperate plea for forgiveness. It implied that men, by their very nature, were less prone to such lapses, their transgressions more easily overlooked or forgiven. Isolde's inner world became a battleground. She wrestled with the injustice of it all, the disproportionate burden placed upon women. She knew her own heart, her own intentions, and she felt a fierce indignation at the ease with which her reputation could be manipulated and destroyed by the idle chatter of others. Yet she also understood the desperate need for acceptance, the primal fear of being cast out. The very system that condemned her also dictated the terms of her belonging. The future, once a landscape of hopeful anticipation, now felt shrouded in uncertainty. Her betrothal to Sir Callan, while still official, was shadowed by the knowledge that his decision to proceed was based on a medically verified status, not necessarily on unwavering trust. The whispers implied that he, too, had been forced to take these measures, a testament to her perceived unreliability. The subtle condescension in his interactions since the examination was a constant reminder of this underlying doubt. He treated her with a newfound, almost patronizing gentleness, as if she were a delicate, potentially flawed artifact that required careful handling. The price of a whisper, Isolde realized with a profound sense of weariness, was far steeper than anyone could ever truly comprehend. It was the erosion of trust, the fracturing of community, the silent crucifixion of a woman's spirit. It was the understanding that no matter how blameless her actions, the narrative could be rewritten, the truth obscured by the mere breath of rumor, leaving her to navigate a world that judged her not for who she was, but for what others chose to believe she might be. The meticulous weaving of the loom of purity demanded a constant vigilance, a perpetual performance, and the slightest deviation, the faintest whisper, could unravel everything. The air in Master Thomas's shop was a thick, cloying tapestry woven from the sharp tang of stale ale, the acrid bite of medicinal herbs, and the ever-present earthy aroma of unwashed bodies. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom from a single grimy window, illuminating the worn wooden counter stained with countless spills of blood and ungage. This was the domain of the barber surgeon, a man whose livelihood was as varied as the tools of his trade, a man who straddled the line between the mundane act of trimming a beard and the more visceral, often life-saving intervention of lancing a festering wound. Today, however, Master Thomas was tasked with a duty far more delicate, far more fraught with the unspoken anxieties of reputation and lineage, a virginity examination. The phrase itself, whispered in hushed tones and laden with consequence, hung in the air like a phantom limb. For a woman, especially one of Isolde's standing, such an examination was not merely a medical procedure. It was a public, albeit covert, validation of her virtue, a shield against the venom of rumor and the potential ruin of her family's name. And Master Thomas, with his calloused hands and an understanding of female anatomy, gleaned more from hearsay and occasional necessity than from any formal, refined study, was the man charged with providing that validation. His shop, a cramped space that smelled perpetually of something left too long unfinished, was hardly the sterile sanctuary one might associate with such a critical assessment. It was a place where the intimate details of men's faces met the raw realities of their ailments, a place where the scent of disinfectant fought a losing battle against the pervasive odors of human life. Isolde's mother, Lady Eleanor, had orchestrated the visit with a practiced air of discretion, a necessity born from the very nature of the task. It was not something to be advertised, nor openly discussed, yet the need for it was starkly apparent. The whispers, the averted gazes, the subtle chill that had begun to settle around Isolde's presence in the village, these were the symptoms of a reputation under siege. The barber surgeon's pronouncement, delivered with the authority of one who dealt with the corporeal, was intended to be the definitive cure, the seal of approval that would banish the shadows of doubt. When Isolde arrived, accompanied by her mother and a silent, watchful maid, the shop was empty save for Master Thomas himself. He was a man of sturdy build, his apron perpetually smeared with the residue of his trade, his hands surprisingly steady despite their rough appearance. His gaze, when he turned to greet them, was assessing, practiced in reading the subtle cues of fear and anxiety that often accompanied his clients. He had seen enough of the world, enough of its harsh realities, to understand the weight of what he was about to do. My Lady Eleanor, he greeted, his voice gruff but not unkind. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging her station. Then his eyes shifted to Isolde, taking in her youthful composure, the slight tension in her shoulders that betrayed her unease. And Lady Isolde, welcome. The examination itself was a stark illustration of the era's profound ignorance regarding female anatomy, a testament to the vulnerability of women subjected to such invasive scrutiny. Master Thomas's methods were crude, relying on touch and a considerable amount of guesswork. There was no intricate knowledge of internal structures, no sophisticated diagnostic tools. His understanding was largely empirical, built on a lifetime of dealing with the visible, the tangible, the ailments that could be seen and felt on the surface. For something as subtle as the evidence of virginity, his approach was necessarily rudimentary. He led Isolde to a darkened alcove, where a stool covered with a worn, somewhat stained linen cloth awaited her. Lady Eleanor remained close, her presence a silent, unwavering support, yet her own anxiety was palpable. The maid stood by the door, her face a mask of stoic neutrality, but her tightly clasped hands betrayed her own apprehension. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken expectations, with the raw vulnerability of the situation. Master Thomas, with a gruff apology for the lack of finer accommodations, began his task. He had no qualms about the physical act. It was, after all, part of his profession, a necessary unpleasantness. What he perhaps didn't fully grasp, or at least didn't articulate, was the profound social and emotional weight attached to this particular examination. For Isolde, it was a deeply personal invasion, a moment where her body, her very essence, was being subjected to the judgment of a man whose understanding was, at best, limited. His assessment relied on external observation, on the feel of the hymen. He would have been looking for a certain degree of tightness, a certain resistance to touch. He might have gently probed, attempting to ascertain the presence of a membrane. The process was inherently imprecise, prone to misinterpretation, and dependent on the individual's unique physical characteristics. Some women were born with a hymen that was naturally more elastic, less complete, making them appear less virginal, even if they had never known a man. Others might have experienced minor tears or abrasions from physical activity, such as riding a horse or participating in strenuous labor, which could be misconstrued. Master Thomas, however, was a man of his time, and in his time, such nuances were rarely considered. His opinion, based on his limited examination, would be accepted as fact. He would feel, he would assess, and he would render his verdict. The scent of the disinfectant he used to clean his hands and instruments, a sharp, cleansing odor, did little to dispel the inherent discomfort of the moment. As he worked, Isolde focused on her breathing, trying to remain as still and composed as possible. She thought of the whispers, of the casual cruelty of gossip, of the way a single incident, a moment of innocent interaction, could be twisted into something sordid and damning. She felt a surge of anger, a hot, righteous indignation at the injustice of it all. Her worth, her future, her very identity were being judged by a physical marker, an arbitrary testament to an experience she had yet to share. Master Thomas eventually withdrew, his expression unreadable. He gestured for Lady Eleanor to approach him, and they moved to a corner of the shop, their voices low and indistinct. Isolde watched them, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant clatter of carts in the street and the murmur of voices from beyond the shop's confines. Finally, Master Thomas returned, wiping his hands on his apron. He met Isolde's gaze directly, his expression now one of professional finality. "She is sound," he announced, his voice clear and resonant in the hushed space, "untouched." The words, though a relief, felt hollow. Sound, as if she were livestock being judged for market. Untouched, as if her worth were solely defined by what she had not yet experienced. Lady Eleanor let out a small sigh, a sound of profound relief that was tinged with a weariness that spoke of the constant vigilance required to maintain a woman's reputation. She placed a hand on Isolde's arm, her grip firm. "Thank you, Master Thomas," she said, her voice regaining its usual measured tone. She then discreetly handed him a small pouch of coins, the agreed upon fee for his services, a payment for his silence and his pronouncement. As they left the barber surgeon's shop, stepping back into the relative anonymity of the street, Isolde felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly, that the immediate threat of social condemnation had been averted, but also a deep-seated resentment, a dawning understanding of the precariousness of her position and the arbitrary nature of the judgments cast upon women. Master Thomas, the barber surgeon, with his crude tools and his limited knowledge, held a power over her reputation that felt both absolute and deeply unjust. His grasp on the scales of judgment was not one of impartial wisdom, but of blunt, unthinking application, a reflection of a society that valued surface appearances and assumed the worst until proven otherwise by the most invasive of means. The examination had been a success, a medical fact established, but the underlying vulnerability, the susceptibility to the whispers of Etheria, remained. The barber surgeon's word was a temporary dam against the tide of suspicion, but the tide itself, fueled by ignorance and prejudice, was ever present, waiting for the next ripple to break through. The late afternoon sun, strained through the dense canopy of the whisperwood, cast long dancing shadows across the mossy ground. Here, in a clearing shielded by ancient oaks and whispering pines, a peculiar assembly had gathered. It was not a market-day throng, nor a gathering for harvest or revelry, but something far more hushed, more clandestine, a group of women, their faces etched with a potent blend of hope and desperation, had come together, drawn by the promise of a truth that the spoken word often failed to convey. They were seekers of certainty, participants in a ritual as old as the forest itself, a ritual known as the Crimson Thread. At the center of the clearing, a low, flat stone served as an altar. Upon it lay the focal point of their devotion, a length of thread dyed a deep, vibrant crimson. This was no ordinary yarn spun from the fleece of sheep. Legend, passed down through generations of women, claimed it was imbued with a potent magic, a sensitivity to the very essence of purity. It had been prepared with meticulous care, steeped in specific herbs under the watchful gaze of the moon, and woven with intentions as fierce and unwavering as the will of any warrior. The belief was simple, yet profound. The thread would react, subtly or dramatically, to the presence of a maiden of true innocence, untouched by carnal knowledge, would evoke a specific response. A maiden who had strayed, who had surrendered her virtue, would elicit a different, perhaps even a malevolent, tremor from the crimson strand. The air in the clearing was thick with a palpable tension, a collective holding of breath. The women, ranging from anxious mothers seeking to secure advantageous marriages for their daughters, to young women themselves bracing for the pronouncement, stood in a loose semicircle. Their gazes were fixed on Alara, the elder of the group, a woman whose lined face spoke of many seasons of experience and a quiet authority that needed no spoken decree. She held the crimson thread, her gnarled fingers moving with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. The silence was punctuated only by the rustling of leaves overhead and the distant call of a bird, sounds that seemed to amplify the gravity of the moment. Ilara began to speak, her voice a low murmur that carried surprisingly far in the stillness. The old ways hold truths that the hurried world forgets, she intoned, her eyes scanning the faces before her. And this thread, she lifted it slightly, letting it catch the dappled sunlight, is a witness. It does not lie, nor does it judge with malice. It merely reflects the truth that resides within. Her words were not a pronouncement of guilt or innocence, but a gentle preparation, a setting of the stage for the silent, ancient judgment. The first maiden to approach was young Lyra, accompanied by her mother, who clutched her arm with a desperate intensity. Lyra's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a forced bravery. She had heard the whispers, seen the knowing glances. The possibility of an unfavorable outcome weighed heavily on her young shoulders. Alara beckoned her forward. With trembling hands, Lyra reached out and gently, hesitantly, touched the crimson thread. The gathered women watched, their breath held captive. For a long moment, nothing happened. The thread lay inert, a silent crimson ribbon against the dark stone. Then a subtle change. It seemed to shiver, a faint vibration that passed through its length. It didn't coil, it didn't snap, but a barely perceptible tightening, a minute stiffening rippled through it. Ilara nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, and Lyra's mother let out a soft, almost inaudible sigh. It was not a clear condemnation, nor a triumphant affirmation, but a nuanced response that left the interpretation open to the most fervent hopes. Ilara then turned to Lyra's mother, her gaze holding a silent understanding. The thread, it has spoken its first word, she said, her voice deliberately vague. What you hear in its whisper is for your own heart to discern, and for the world to witness as you choose. Next came Anya, a woman whose reputation had been more openly discussed, more readily questioned. Her journey to this clearing was not driven by parental anxiety, but by her own fierce desire to reclaim her narrative, to silence the gossip that had begun to poison her life. She approached the stone with a resolute set to her jaw, her eyes meeting Ilara's with a quiet defiance. Anya, too, placed her fingers on the crimson thread. This time, the reaction was more pronounced. The thread did not simply shiver, it seemed to writhe, a subtle, serpentine movement that sent a collective gasp through the onlookers. It coiled slightly, a tightening that was undeniable, a distinct darkening of its hue, as if it had absorbed some unseen stain. Anya's face, which had held a flicker of hope, fell. She didn't cry out, didn't protest. She simply withdrew her hand, her shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. Alara offered no explanation, no interpretation. The starkness of the thread's reaction was its own pronouncement, a truth that needed no further embellishment. Anya turned and walked away, not with the hurried steps of shame, but with the measured pace of someone who had faced a truth, however painful, and would carry its burden. The ritual continued, each woman who stepped forward to touch the thread becoming a focal point of intense scrutiny. There was Mara, whose youth and vivacity had always made her a target for speculation. Her touch caused the thread to twist and writhe, its crimson deepening to a near black, a stark contrast to the vibrant hue it held when first presented. Her mother, standing rigidly beside her, turned away, unable to bear the visual testament to her daughter's perceived indiscretion. There was the quiet, demure Elodie, whose touch seemed to calm the thread, making it lie still and smooth, a clear affirmation of her untouched state. Her mother wept silent tears of relief, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Each interaction was a silent drama, a negotiation between tradition, superstition, and the raw, often harsh, realities of female existence in Etheria. The crimson thread, imbued with the beliefs and fears of generations, acted as a mirror, reflecting not just the physical state of the maidens, but the anxieties and expectations of the society that surrounded them. It was a tool born of desperation, a desperate attempt to find tangible proof of virtue in a world where a woman's worth was so intrinsically tied to her perceived purity, a purity that was so easily questioned and so difficult to unequivocally prove. The woods themselves seemed to participate in the solemnity of the occasion. The dappled light, the rustling leaves, the ancient trees standing as silent, unmoving witnesses, all contributed to an atmosphere thick with a primal, almost ancestral energy. It felt as if the very forest was holding its breath, waiting to see how these mortal dramas would unfold, how the crimson thread would weave its tales of innocence and transgression. The clearing, usually a place of quiet solitude, was transformed into a theater of judgment, where the most intimate truths were laid bare, not through confession, but through the silent, unyielding response of a dyed strand of thread. The belief in the thread's efficacy was not born of logic, but of faith, a faith deeply rooted in the need for certainty in matters of reputation. In a society where a woman's reputation was a fragile commodity, easily shattered by rumor and insinuation, any means of solidifying it was embraced. The barber surgeon's examination, though perhaps more medically grounded, was still a limited, invasive procedure, dependent on the individual physician's skill and interpretation. The crimson thread offered something different, a seemingly objective, almost supernatural validation, a truth that transcended human fallibility. It was a tangible manifestation of an intangible virtue, a physical anchor for the abstract concept of purity. The women who participated in this ritual were not naive. They understood the inherent subjectivity of the process, the possibility of misinterpretation, the sheer force of belief that could color perception. Yet the need for an answer, for some form of definitive proof, outweighed the intellectual objections. They clung to the belief that the thread, in its mystical way, could perceive what was hidden, what was true at the deepest level. It was a desperate gamble, a plea to an ancient power for a judgment that would silence the wagging tongues and secure their futures. As the afternoon waned and the shadows lengthened, the ritual drew to a close. The women dispersed, each carrying with them the silent verdict of the crimson thread, a verdict that would shape their lives, their relationships, and their standing within the community. Some would carry the relief of affirmation, their reputations bolstered by the thread's pronouncement. Others would bear the burden of its condemnation, their paths forward now shadowed by a truth revealed in a secluded clearing, by the silent ancient witness of the crimson thread. The ritual, in its stark simplicity and profound significance, underscored the immense pressure placed upon women to conform to societal expectations and the desperate lengths to which they would go to prove their adherence to the unwritten laws of purity and virtue. The forest reclaimed its silence, the clearing returned to its solitude, but the echoes of the ritual, the whispers of truth and consequence, lingered in the hearts of those who had participated, a testament to a world where a crimson thread could hold the weight of a woman's entire destiny. The ritual, though steeped in superstition, was a potent symbol of the deep-seated anxieties surrounding female sexuality and reputation in Etheria. It was a performance of truth, enacted in the hushed sanctity of the woods, where the natural world served as both witness and participant in the deeply personal dramas of women seeking validation. The thread, dyed with the blood red of life and passion, became a conduit for societal judgments, a silent arbiter in the complex and often unforgiving arena of female honor. The women gathered did so not out of idle curiosity, but from a profound need for certainty in a world that so easily cast doubt. They sought a truth that could shield them from the harsh realities of gossip, protect their families' standing, and secure their futures in a society that held a woman's virtue as a paramount currency. The ritual was a testament to this vulnerability, a desperate, almost primal appeal to an ancient power to affirm what was so easily called into question. The act of preparing the thread itself was a testament to the seriousness with which this ritual was undertaken. It was not simply plucked from a weaver's stock. It had been meticulously steeped in a concoction of herbs known for their supposed purifying properties: rosemary for remembrance and clarity, lavender for peace and truth, and the potent blood-red petals of the wild poppy, symbolizing both life and a certain illicit passion that needed to be controlled. The precise recipe was guarded, passed down through trusted matriarchs, each ingredient chosen for its symbolic weight and its perceived ability to interact with the spiritual essence of innocence. It was dyed under the new moon, a time of beginnings and hidden potentials, and then left to dry in the cool, still air of dawn absorbing the quiet strength of the nascent day. The entire process was an act of faith, a ritualistic invocation of natural forces to reveal his hidden truth. Elara, the elder, approached each maiden with a measured grace. Her hands, weathered by time and work, were surprisingly steady as she guided the hesitant touch of the young women. Her role was not to judge, but to facilitate the thread's interaction. She understood the anxieties of her audience, the palpable fear that rippled through the clearing with each new subject. She had witnessed this ritual countless times, seen the relief flood a mother's face, the slump of despair in a daughter's shoulders. Her expression remained one of quiet solemnity, a reflection of the deep respect she held for the traditions she upheld. When young Lyra approached, her mother's hand a clammy grip on her arm, the air crackled with unspoken fear. Lyra, barely more than a girl, her face a canvas of nascent womanhood, hesitated. The crimson thread lay before her, a vivid streak against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. Ilara gently encouraged her forward, Lyra's fingers, trembling like young leaves in a breeze, brushed against the thread. There was a subtle tremor, a barely perceptible stiffening, as if the thread itself had drawn a sharp intake of breath. It didn't writhe or darken, but it gained a certain rigidity, a resistance that suggested a delicate boundary encountered. Ilara's nod was slow, deliberate. "The thread acknowledges your presence," she murmured, her gaze meeting Lyra's with a quiet understanding. "Its stillness is a question, not an answer. How you choose to interpret its silence is where the true testament lies." Lyra's mother, her own face a mask of desperate hope, squeezed her daughter's arm, a silent prayer in her touch. The ambiguity of the thread's reaction was in a way a small mercy, offering a sliver of hope that the whispers might yet be silenced by time and careful conduct. Anya's arrival was met with a different kind of tension. Her reputation was not one of shy innocence, but of spirited independence, a quality that in the eyes of many bordered on recklessness. She approached the stone not with Lyra's trepidation, but with a quiet, almost defiant resolve. Her touch was firm, her fingers pressing down on the crimson thread with a deliberate force. The reaction was immediate and stark. The thread, seemingly alive, recoiled. It twisted, its vibrant color darkening to a bruised, ominous shade, as if absorbing the very essence of a transgression. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Anya flinched, a fleeting shadow crossing her face, but she did not withdraw her hand. She held her ground, bearing witness to the thread's undeniable pronouncement. Alara's gaze was steady, her voice devoid of judgment. "The thread has spoken its truth," she said, her tone carrying the weight of ages. "It has shown its color." Anya eventually pulled her hand away, her shoulders squared, but the unshakable truth of the thread's reaction hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the fragile hope that had accompanied Lyra. The ritual continued, each touch a miniature drama played out against the backdrop of the ancient woods. There was Ilara's own niece, young Clara, whose mother's reputation was in tatters. Clara, naive and trusting, touched the thread, and it remained placid, its crimson hue as vibrant as ever. Her mother, weeping silently, showered her daughter with praise, seeing this as a testament to her own efforts to instill virtue, a vindication against the slanders she faced. Then there was old Mother Maeve, who, having long passed the age of maidenhood, participated more out of tradition and a desire to offer comfort to the younger women. Her touch a steady reassurance to the thread, a silent affirmation of a life lived. The women who came to this clearing were not blind to the limitations of their practice. They understood that the thread's reaction could be influenced by many things: the skill of the dyer, the herbs used in its preparation, even the emotional state of the person touching it. Yet, in the face of societal pressure and the devastating consequences of a tarnished reputation, the belief in the thread's ultimate truthfulness was a powerful anchor. It offered a tangible, albeit superstitious means of asserting control in a world where so much was beyond their command. The ritual was a public declaration, a communal performance of a deeply personal truth, a way of weaving a narrative of innocence that could withstand the fraying edges of rumor and insinuation. It was a desperate plea for validation, whispered into the ancient heart of the forest, answered by the silent, unwavering testimony of the crimson thread. The sheer weight of tradition, the generations of women who had sought solace and certainty in this very act, lent an undeniable power to the ritual, transforming it from a simple superstition into a profound cultural practice, a testament to the enduring human need for truth and the unyielding desire for a good name. The clearing, bathed in the fading light, held within it the echoes of countless silent judgments, the imprints of anxieties, as old as the trees themselves. The physician, Master Alaric, arrived not with the hushed reverence of the forest clearing, but with the rustle of fine wool and the scent of dried herbs that clung to his person like a second skin. His entrance into Lady Annalise's bedchamber was an event in itself, a carefully orchestrated performance of learned authority. The chamber, usually a sanctuary of soft fabrics and filtered sunlight, felt suddenly transformed into an examination room. Gilded mirrors reflected the flickering candlelight, casting dancing shadows that seemed to lend an almost theatrical quality to the proceedings. Alaric, his brow furrowed in concentration, carried with him a worn leather satchel from which he began to draw forth an array of instruments: slender probes, glass vials, and a thin, leather bound tome filled with intricate illustrations of the human form. Lady Annalise, herself a figure of delicate refinement, reclined against a mound of silken pillows, her expression a carefully schooled blend of apprehension and a resigned dignity. She had endured such examinations before, each one a subtle reinforcement of her societal role, a reminder that her body, particularly her reproductive capacity, was a matter of public and familial concern. Unlike the desperate villagers who sought the tangible, if superstitious, validation of the crimson thread, her ordeal was a matter of social necessity. A suitable match, a robust lineage, these were the pillars upon which her future and that of her family rested. And Master Alaric, with his discerning gaze and pronouncements drawn from ancient Galenic principles, was the gatekeeper to that certainty. Your ladyship, Alaric began, his voice a smooth baritone, pitched to convey both professional gravitas and a practiced gentleness, we must ascertain the completeness of your constitution. The humors must be in balance, the vital spirits flowing freely for nature to perform its intended function. He gestured vaguely towards her lower abdomen. His eyes, though trained on her face, seemed to pierce through the layers of linen and silk, as if able to perceive the hidden landscape beneath. His knowledge, gleaned from the dusty scrolls of Hippocrates and Galen, was impressive, yet it was also a system built on observation. Yes, but observation filtered through a lens of deeply ingrained presumptions about the female body. He spoke of the uterus as a passive vessel, its health contingent upon the proper regulation of menstrual flow, the very absence of which could signify illness or, more ominously, a failure of conception. The symptoms he sought were external, observable markers: the pallor of the skin, the state of the pulse, the clarity of the eye. He would prod and question, seeking irregularities that to his trained mind spoke volumes. He consulted his text, its pages brittle with age, and pointed to an illustration of a uterus depicted with a stark, almost geometrical precision. The womb, he explained, tracing a line with his finger, is like a garden. It requires careful tending, and its fertility is a reflection of the overall health of the soil, so to speak. The soil he referred to was, of course, Lady Annalise's entire being, but his focus remained resolutely fixed on the organs of reproduction. He asked about her monthly cycles, not with a physician's curiosity about biological rhythm, but with an interrogator's insistence on regularity and predictability. Are they timely, my lady, without undue pain or excessive loss? His questions were not designed to understand her experience, but to categorize it, to fit it into the established framework of medical theory. A deviation from the norm, even a slight one, was a potential red flag, a hint of imbalance that could have far reaching consequences for her marital prospects. He then produced a small, polished silver speculum, an instrument that in his hands appeared less like a tool of healing and more like a scientific probe. The very notion of introducing such an object into a woman's body was, to many, fraught with both medical necessity and a profound sense of violation. Yet for the aristocracy, it was a necessary, if uncomfortable, reality. He explained its purpose with detached clinicality. This will allow me to observe the cervix, to ensure there are no obstructions, no signs of miasma clinging to the inner pathways. The language itself, miasma, obstructions, spoke of an understanding of the body as a system prone to corruption, an architecture that could become blocked or diseased. As he prepared to use the speculum, Lady Annalise turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting her maid's across the room. There was a shared, unspoken understanding, a brief moment of solidarity in the face of this clinical intrusion. The maid, a woman who had witnessed many such examinations, offered a subtle nod of reassurance. Yet, despite the veneer of professionalism, the act itself was undeniably intimate, a stark contrast to the social decorum that usually governed interactions between men and women of their station. Alaric's examination was thorough, his touch precise, almost mechanical. He made notes in a small, leather-bound ledger, his quill scratching softly against the parchment. He observed the texture of her skin, the clarity of her eyes, the strength of her pulse at the wrist. He even instructed her to cough, listening intently to her chest with a cone of polished wood, an early rudimentary stethoscope. Each observation was a data point, contributing to a larger diagnosis of her overall humoral balance, and by extension, her potential fertility. However, what was conspicuously absent was a true engagement with Lady Annalise's subjective experience. Her anxieties, her hopes, her own understanding of her body's signals, these were not factored into his assessment. His knowledge was vast, his intentions perhaps even benevolent, but his framework was inherently paternalistic. He operated under the assumption that he, as the learned physician, possessed the objective truth about her physiology, a truth that she, as a woman, was incapable of fully grasping or articulating. The physician's presumption, as it might be called, was that his academic understanding superseded her lived reality. He spoke of the vapors that could ascend from the uterus to the brain, causing maladies of the mind. He attributed certain emotional states to the shifting tides of her internal humors, particularly the influence of the moon on her reproductive cycle. The moon's pull, he stated, adjusting his spectacles, can affect the very fluids within your being, my lady, causing perturbations. His words, though couched in the language of natural philosophy, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding, a projection of external forces onto an internal landscape he could only theorize about. He also made assumptions based on her social standing. A noblewoman, he reasoned, would naturally have a more refined and delicate constitution than a peasant woman. Her blood would be purer, her humors more easily disturbed by even the slightest imbalance. This, in turn, influenced his interpretation of her symptoms. A slight pallor, which might be dismissed in a working woman, could be a sign of serious imbalance in Lady Annalise. Conversely, a certain robustness, a liveliness that might be seen as healthy in another, could be interpreted as an excess of choleric humor in her. His diagnosis was not purely scientific, it was interwoven with the social fabric of her existence. The examination was not merely about physical health, it was a subtle assessment of her suitability as a wife and mother, a validation of her potential to fulfill the most crucial societal expectation placed upon her. If he found no overt signs of disease or significant humoral imbalance, his pronouncement would be one of qualified approval. Your constitution appears sound, my lady, he might declare, though vigilance regarding the regularity of your cycles is advised. Should you conceive, I would recommend specific poultices to ensure the healthy development of the fetus. Should he find an irregularity, his pronouncements would carry a different weight. A delayed menstruation, for instance, would not simply be a biological event, but a potential harbinger of barrenness, a failure of the body's machinery. The flow is hesitant, he might note, his gaze sharpening. This suggests a stagnation of the vital spirits, a blockage in the womb's natural expulsion. We must address this with bloodletting to clear the impediment. The solution, bloodletting, was itself a practice rooted in the theory of balancing humors, a method that, while aiming to restore equilibrium, could often weaken the patient further. The clinical detachment with which Alaric conducted his examination was, in a way, a reflection of the intellectual currents of his time. Medicine was striving for a more rational, systematic approach, moving away from purely superstitious practices like those that might have characterized earlier eras or village folk remedies. Yet, in this pursuit of rationalism, there was a tendency to objectify the patient, to treat the body as a machine with observable, quantifiable parts, rather than as a living, feeling entity. And for the female body, this objectification was particularly pronounced, due to the prevailing patriarchal understanding of women as inherently weaker, more mysterious, and less rational than men. Lady Annalise, for her part, bore the examination with a stoic grace. She understood its significance, the weight of the physician's words. Her worth, in the eyes of many, was tied to her ability to bear children, to secure the continuation of a noble line. The physician's assessment was, therefore, more than a medical opinion. It was a social decree. His presumptions, his interpretations of her physical state, would shape her destiny, influencing the terms of her marriage, the respect afforded to her by her husband's family, and her own sense of self worth. The room, with its opulent furnishings, served as a stark backdrop to the clinical nature of the procedure. It was a place of intimacy, of personal life. Yet it was here that Alaric performed his duty, his learned pronouncements echoing in the quiet space. He represented a different kind of authority than the elder women at the Crimson Thread ritual. While they relied on ancient belief and collective faith, Alaric wielded the authority of empirical observation, of classical texts, of a scientific method, albeit one still in its nascent stages and heavily influenced by deeply ingrained societal biases. His knowledge was both a comfort and a cage, offering the illusion of understanding while reinforcing limitations. He spoke of the seed and the soil metaphor, a common analogy in discussions of procreation. The man provided the active seed, the woman the receptive soil. While not entirely inaccurate in its basic premise, this view relegated the woman to a passive role, her contribution primarily physical and biological, lacking the intellectual or spiritual agency attributed to the man. Alaric's texts, filled with anatomical diagrams, depicted the male reproductive organs with far greater detail and emphasis than those of the female, reflecting a societal hierarchy that mirrored this perceived biological disparity. The physician's presumption lay not just in his knowledge, but in the very act of interpreting and validating a woman's reproductive capacity. He assumed the right to diagnose, to pronounce upon her fertility, to offer solutions based on his theoretical understanding. He was the expert, she the subject of his study. This dynamic, while perhaps necessary for a medical assessment, also served to reinforce the societal belief that women's bodies were mysteries to be deciphered by men, their functions governed by forces and understandings beyond their own comprehension or control. He packed his instruments with the same meticulous care with which he had deployed them. His task was complete, his assessment rendered. Lady Annalise was left to process his words, to translate his medical jargon into the language of her own life, her own future. The encounter, though brief, had been significant, a carefully managed performance of knowledge and expectation. It highlighted the stark contrast between the intimate communal rituals of village women and the more formalized, intellectually driven, yet equally presumptuous examinations conducted by learned physicians within the more privileged strata of society. Both sought a form of truth about women's bodies, but their methods, their tools, and the underlying assumptions that guided them revealed much about the differing social worlds they inhabited and the enduring power of established hierarchies in shaping even the most personal of truths, the clinical aura, the detachment, the reliance on ancient texts, and observable symptoms, all underscored a mode of understanding that, while progressing beyond mere superstition, remained firmly anchored in an era where women's bodies were as much subjects of learned discourse as they were of lived experience, and in that discourse, the physician's presumption often held more sway than the woman's own truth. The stark reality of medieval society, particularly concerning matters of sexual purity and marital fidelity, was woven with threads of profound hypocrisy, a hypocrisy most glaringly evident in the unequal standards applied to men and women. While Lady Annalise and countless women like her were subjected to invasive medical examinations, often involving instruments that were both clinical and unsettling, the men in their lives, their prospective husbands, fathers, and brothers, moved through society with an almost effortless immunity from such scrutiny. A man's reputation, his honor, was typically established through his actions in the public sphere, his prowess in battle, his acumen in trade, or his adherence to codes of chivalry. His word was often considered his bond, and his past, particularly his sexual past, was a realm rarely, if ever, investigated with the same rigor and suspicion that was routinely applied to women. This pervasive double standard was not merely a social quirk, it was a fundamental pillar of the patriarchal structure that underpinned medieval life. Women were inherently viewed as the repositories of lineage and purity. Their chastity before marriage and their fidelity within it were paramount to the legitimacy of heirs and the continuation of family honor. Consequently, any doubt, any suspicion, however unfounded, could lead to invasive procedures and public humiliation. The societal narrative painted women as inherently susceptible to temptation, prone to deceit, and requiring constant vigilance. A woman's worth was intrinsically linked to her perceived purity, and this purity was a fragile commodity, constantly under threat and in need of demonstrable proof. Consider the societal expectation placed upon a young nobleman seeking a bride. His lineage, his wealth, and his character were generally accepted at face value. The whispers and rumors that might circulate about his youthful indiscretions were often dismissed as the natural exuberance of a young man finding his way in the world. His sexual experiences, if any, were not seen as compromising his ability to be a virtuous husband or a capable patriarch. Indeed, some might even argue that a certain degree of worldly experience was beneficial, equipping him with the knowledge and confidence needed to manage a household and navigate the complexities of society. His male peers would likely offer a knowing nod, a shared understanding of male camaraderie rather than censure. Contrast this with the ordeal faced by a woman of similar standing. Her maidenhead was a prized possession, not just for her, but for her family. Its intactness was a prerequisite for a desirable marriage, a tangible guarantee of her virtue and her ability to carry forward the family name untainted. Should any doubt arise, perhaps from a whispered accusation or a perceived impropriety, the societal reaction was swift and unforgiving. While a man might shrug off such gossip, a woman often found herself under intense pressure to prove her purity. This could involve the aforementioned medical examinations, designed to ascertain signs of defloration or any perceived irregularities in her reproductive health, or it could involve more public rituals and interrogations where her very character was laid bare for public judgment. The very language used to describe male and female sexuality reflected this imbalance. A man's sexual encounters were often described with terms that implied prowess, adventure, or even conquest. A woman's, on the other hand, were more likely to be framed in terms of submission, vulnerability, or even sin. The concept of a man sowing his wild oats was a widely accepted trope, a rite of passage that normalized male sexual exploration. There was no equivalent concept for women. For them, any deviation from a strictly chaste path was seen as a transgression, a moral failing that could have devastating consequences. The legal and social frameworks of the time further entrenched this double standard. Adultery, for instance, was a crime that carried vastly different penalties depending on the gender of the perpetrator, while a wife's infidelity was considered a grave offense, often leading to severe punishment, including ostracization and the loss of dower rights. A husband's adultery was often viewed with a more tolerant, albeit still disapproving, eye. The primary concern for a man's infidelity was its potential to introduce illegitimate heirs into the family line, thus threatening the inheritance. For a woman, her infidelity was a threat to the very foundation of the patriarchal family, undermining her husband's honor and the legitimacy of his descendants. This inherent suspicion directed towards women also manifested in the way their bodies were perceived and treated. The female body was often shrouded in mystery, viewed as more fragile, more susceptible to corruption, and less rational than the male body. Physicians like Master Alaric, while operating within the scientific understanding of their era, were nonetheless products of this societal conditioning. Their examinations, though presented as objective medical procedures, were implicitly shaped by the underlying assumption that women's bodies were inherently more problematic and required more rigorous investigation. The very act of examining a woman's reproductive organs was in many ways an attempt to demystify what society deemed inherently mysterious and potentially untrustworthy. The societal expectation was not simply that women should be pure, but that they should be able to prove their purity. This burden of proof was almost entirely absent for men. A man's virtue was assumed, a woman's was suspect, until proven otherwise. This asymmetry created a constant state of anxiety for women, a perpetual need to guard their reputations and to navigate a social landscape where their bodies were public property, subject to scrutiny and judgment at every turn. The Crimson Thread ritual, as described previously, was a manifestation of this societal pressure. While ostensibly a ritual of purification and blessing, it was also a public declaration and validation of a woman's premarital chastity. The absence of a similar, widely recognized ritual for men underscored the differential expectations placed upon the sexes. For women, their sexual history was a matter of public record, a narrative that was constantly being written and revised by the judgments of society. For men, it was a private affair, largely invisible and inconsequential to their social standing. The contrast between the intimate, often invasive examinations of women and the largely unexamined lives of men in this regard highlights the deep-seated patriarchal biases that permeated medieval society. It was a system that placed an enormous burden on women to maintain a purity that was rarely demanded of men with the same intensity. This double standard was not merely a reflection of social norms, it was a deliberate mechanism for maintaining patriarchal control, ensuring that women remained in a subordinate position, their worth and respectability contingent on their perceived sexual virtue, a virtue that was constantly policed and for women often demanded to be proven. The scales of judgment were demonstrably and unfairly tipped. The parchment lay on the heavy oak table, its ink stark and unforgiving against the vellum. For Ilara, it was more than just a document. It was a death sentence, delivered not by the blade of an executioner, but by the cold, impartial pronouncements of men. The words swam before her eyes, a blur of legalistic jargon that confirmed the absolute ruin of her life. annulment. The decree was absolute, severing the sacred bonds of marriage that had been so briefly, so joyously her own. It was a word that ripped her from the life she had known, a life of hopeful expectation, of shared laughter with a man who, just weeks ago, had sworn his love and his fidelity. Now he was merely a stranger, her marriage a void, a contractual error deemed null and void by the very men who had overseen her examination. The shame that washed over her was a physical wave, hot and suffocating. She could feel the phantom touch of Master Alaric's instruments, the indignity of the probing, the whisper of judgment that had accompanied every step of the agonizing process. It had been presented as a matter of course, a necessary formality to ensure the legitimacy of the union, but the result, the supposed failure of the Crimson Thread test, had transformed it into a public spectacle of her supposed impurity. The whispers had started even before the official pronouncement, slithering through the halls of her husband's family estate like venomous vipers. Now, those whispers would swell into a roar, a condemnation that would follow her wherever she went. Her family, once her sanctuary, had become a place of cold disapproval. Her father, a man who had always prided himself on his honor and his keen eye for a worthy match, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. Her mother, usually a font of comforting words, had turned away, her silence a more damning accusation than any shouted word. The humiliation was not confined to the annulment. The annulment itself was the gateway to a far more profound desolation. She was not merely a wronged wife, she was a tainted woman, her reputation irrevocably tarnished. The very foundations of her social existence had crumbled, leaving her adrift in a sea of societal ostracism. She remembered the eager anticipation of her wedding day, the rustle of her finest gown, the scent of the lilies woven into her hair. She remembered the vows exchanged, the hopeful glances, the dreams of children and a shared future. Now all of it was an illusion, a cruel jest played out by fate and the unforgiving dictates of societal expectation. The pronouncement of annulment meant she was no longer a wife. More than that, it meant she was a woman who had failed the most fundamental test of female virtue. The crimson thread, a symbol meant to attest to her purity, had instead become a banner of her supposed defilement. The reality of her banishment began to set in with chilling clarity. Her husband's family, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, had made it clear that she was no longer welcome. Her own family, shamed by her perceived transgression, could barely meet her gaze. There was no returning to the warmth and security of her childhood home, not as the woman she was now. The doors that had always been open were now firmly shut, the smiles replaced by averted eyes. She was an inconvenience, a source of disgrace, a living testament to a failure that society could not tolerate. The consequences extended beyond the immediate fallout of the annulment. Her dowry, the considerable sum her father had provided to secure the advantageous marriage, was now a subject of dispute, the very legitimacy of her union casting a shadow over its terms. Even if she were to reclaim it, it would be a grim reminder of the failed alliance, a symbol of her inadequacy. More importantly, her prospects for any future marriage were now virtually non-existent. Who would take a woman whose virginity had been publicly questioned, whose character had been deemed suspect by the most stringent of tests? The whispers would be louder, the judgments more severe, the path forward a desolate landscape devoid of hope. She sat in the cold, sterile room assigned to her, a room stripped of the comforts and adornments that had once made it a private haven. It felt like a cell, a place of confinement for a crime she had not committed, a crime defined by the very fabric of the society that now condemned her. The dreams she had harbored, of children playing in sun drenched gardens, of growing old beside a beloved husband, of leaving a legacy of love and family, all lay shattered around her like shards of broken glass. The weight of her situation was almost unbearable. She was alone, stripped of her husband, her home, and her good name. The social structures that were meant to protect and uphold women had instead served to ensnare and condemn her. There was no recourse, no appeal, no sympathetic ear that could truly understand the depth of her despair. The crimson thread, once a symbol of a hopeful future, had become a scarlet mark of her ruin. She was an outcast, a pariah, her life a testament to the brutal and unforgiving nature of the scales of judgment that weighed so heavily and so unfairly upon the lives of women. The void left by the annulment was not just legal, it was a profound emptiness that threatened to consume her entirely. She was left with nothing but the echo of broken vows and the chilling realization that a single, flawed test could extinguish every ember of her future. The days that followed were a blur of suffocating silence and crushing despair. Ilara found herself wandering the grounds of her family estate like a ghost, her presence a constant reminder of the scandal. The servants averted their gazes, the familiar faces now etched with a mixture of pity and apprehension. Her father's grief was palpable, a heavy mantle of shame he seemed unable to shed. He had invested not only his fortune, but also his reputation in this marriage, and Ilara's failure was a public repudiation of his judgment. Her mother, while offering the occasional tearful embrace, could not offer solace, her own helplessness a mirror of Ilara's own. The world outside her immediate confinement was even more forbidding. The news of the annulment had spread like wildfire through the local gentry. Invitations that had once been readily extended now ceased altogether. The polite greetings in the market square turned into hushed conversations and pointed stares as she passed. She was no longer Lady Ilara, wife of Lord Geoffrey. She was simply Ilara, the woman who had been found wanting. The stigma clung to her like a shroud, invisible yet palpable to all who encountered her. Her initial hope, a flickering ember in the overwhelming darkness, was that her family might rally around her, offering refuge and support. But even that fragile hope began to dwindle as she saw the strain her presence placed upon them. Her father's business affairs began to suffer, his clients whispering about the cloud of disgrace that now hung over his house. Her mother's health, always delicate, worsened under the constant anxiety. Ilara realized with a heavy heart that her continued presence was a burden, a drain on the very family she had once hoped to uphold. The thought of leaving, of seeking a new life elsewhere, began to take root. But where could she go? Her skills were limited, her education largely confined to the domestic arts expected of a noblewoman. Her name was now a mark of shame, a barrier to any respectable employment or association. The vast majority of her adult life had been shaped by the expectations of marriage and lineage. Without a husband to legitimize her existence in the eyes of society, she was left with a terrifying blankness, an uncertain future with no guiding principles. She tried to recall the details of the examination, the cold clinical touch, the whispered reassurances that felt like lies even as they were spoken. Master Alaric, with his learned pronouncements and his precise instruments, had held her fate in his hands. His word, validated by the church and society, was law. But what if he was wrong? What if his instruments were flawed or his interpretation skewed? These thoughts were dangerous, bordering on heresy in a society that revered such learned men. To question their judgment was to invite further condemnation. The injustice of it all burned within her. She had been a dutiful daughter, a hopeful bride, and a devoted wife in the short time she had been married. She had loved Geoffrey and believed he loved her in return. The annulment was not just a personal tragedy, it was a betrayal of trust on multiple levels. Geoffrey himself had been conspicuously absent since the pronouncement, his silence a deafening confession of his unwillingness to stand by her, or perhaps his inability to defy the societal pressure. He had chosen his reputation, his family honor over her. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she walked by the familiar hedgerows that bordered her family's land, she saw a group of young men approaching. Their laughter was boisterous, their talk of horses and hunting carried on the wind. As they drew closer, their expressions shifted, their casual amusement replaced by a smug recognition. Ilara instinctively pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the ground. She heard one of them call out, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. Look, it's the broken vase, still in one piece, surprisingly. The others chuckled, their eyes raking over her with an appraising gaze that made her skin crawl. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest, desperate to escape their leering attention. This was the reality of her new existence. She was an object of public curiosity, a subject for gossip and ridicule, her worth reduced to a single damning verdict. The stark truth was that there was no safety net for women like her. The very systems that were supposed to provide structure and security were, in practice, instruments of control and subjugation. A woman's honor was a fragile thing, easily shattered and rarely repaired. The societal narrative was clear. A woman's value was intrinsically tied to her purity, and if that purity was ever called into question, her worth plummeted, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. The annulment was not the end of her ordeal, but the beginning of a prolonged exile. She was effectively erased from the social fabric that had once defined her. Her lineage, her family name, her potential for a future, all were sacrificed on the altar of an unyielding societal expectation. The crimson thread had bled not only upon the parchment, but also upon her very soul, staining her life with a mark of shame that even time could not hope to erase. The scales of judgment had tipped, and in their descent, they had crushed her life into dust. There was no redemption to be found, no sympathetic ear that could truly understand the magnitude of her loss, only the hollow echo of a failed test and the chilling silence of a world that had turned its back on her. Even for those who emerged unmarked by the crimson stain, the ordeal was far from over. The physical examination, designed to be definitive, often proved to be anything but. For Agnes, the parchment lay on the worn wooden table, its pronouncement a small mercy that felt more like a continued sentence. Master Alaric had declared her pure, the crimson thread's vibrant hue a testament to her virginity, a fact readily acknowledged by her family, and more importantly, by Lord Valerius's emissaries. The annulment had been averted. Her marriage was secured. Yet the shadow of doubt, insidious and persistent, clung to her like the damp chill of a crypt. The relief she had expected to feel was conspicuously absent. Instead, a gnawing unease settled in its place. She was Lady Agnes now, wife to Lord Valerius, mistress of his ancestral home. But the echoes of the examination chamber followed her. Whispers, though not of defilement, still swirled. They spoke not of her purity, but of her supposed good fortune, her luck in passing the test that had ensnared so many others. It was a subtle shift, a reinterpretation of her victory that rendered it hollow. Her husband, Lord Valerius, a man whose stern countenance rarely softened, had accepted the pronouncement with a nod. He had been present, a silent, imposing figure during the examination, his gaze fixed on Master Alaric's pronouncements, as if assessing the quality of a prize mare. Now he treated her with a formal respect, the respect due to his wife, his property, his investment. But the warmth, the shared glances of affection that she had dared to hope for, remained elusive. He was a man of duty, and his duty now was to a woman who had, by societal standards, proven her worthiness. Yet his approval felt perfunctory, a box ticked rather than a genuine acceptance. The women of his household, those who had initially shown her a degree of pity, now regarded her with a new kind of appraisal. They saw not a woman who had endured an invasive procedure, but a woman who had successfully navigated a treacherous social minefield. Her success became the subject of veiled conversations, of knowing smiles exchanged behind hands. She was fortunate, so they would murmur, their eyes flicking towards her, so fortunate to have escaped the stain. The implication was clear that her passing was not a testament to her character, but to the vagaries of chance, or perhaps even to a cunning ability to perhaps manipulate the outcome, though none dared to voice such an accusation directly. Agnes found herself constantly on edge, her every action scrutinized. If she laughed too heartily, it was seen as an attempt to overcompensate for her earlier near miss. If she was quiet, she was perceived as brooding, perhaps still ashamed of the ordeal, or worse, harboring secrets. There was no winning. The validation was not absolute. It was conditional, perpetually under review. She ate little, her appetite diminished by the constant tension. Sleep offered little respite, often disturbed by fragmented dreams of the examination, of Master Alaric's stern gaze and the damning possibilities of the crimson thread. Her own family, while outwardly relieved, also carried a certain unspoken expectation. Her father, who had spent a considerable sum on her dowry, saw the marriage as a successful venture, a strengthening of their ties. Her mother fussed over her, constantly reminding her of her duty to Lord Valerius, of the importance of maintaining the family's reputation, now that it had been so narrowly preserved. They celebrated her purity, but their celebrations felt like a constant reinforcement of the fact that she had been on the precipice of disgrace. One afternoon, while accompanying Lord Valerius to a small gathering at a neighboring estate, Agnes encountered Lady Isolde, a woman of her own age whose marriage had been annulled a year prior, due to a similar, though perhaps more definitively proven, failure of the crimson thread test. Isolde, now living a quiet life with her parents, approached Agnes with a hesitant smile. Lady Agnes, Isolde began, her voice soft, I, I offer my congratulations that you have been spared such a fate. Agnes managed a polite inclination of her head. Thank you, Lady Isolde. Isolde's smile faltered, a flicker of something akin to sorrow crossing her features. It is a precarious position, is it not? Even when one passes, the world watches, you see. They scrutinize a single misplaced word, a moment of perceived impropriety, and the whispers begin anew. She glanced around, her eyes darting nervously. They never truly forget the test, do they? They simply accept that this time you were deemed acceptable. Her words struck a chord deep within Agnes. She saw the truth in Isolde's weary eyes. The societal structure is built upon rigid notions of female virtue, offered little room for genuine absolution. Once a woman's purity had been called into question, even if she was exonerated by the crude methods of the time, a lingering suspicion often attached itself to her name. It was a taint that no amount of subsequent good behavior could entirely erase. Agnes recalled a conversation she had overheard between two ladies in waiting in Lord Valerius's household. They had been discussing a cousin of Lord Valerius, a woman named Eleanor who had married a distant merchant. Eleanor had been known for her vivacity, her love of dancing, and her rather unconventional intellect. She had married relatively late, and whispers had circulated about her past, though nothing concrete had ever been proven. Agnes remembered one of the ladies remarking, Poor Eleanor, she's a good sort, I suppose, but one always wonders, doesn't one, especially with her independent spirit. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Eleanor's independent spirit was in itself a potential red flag, a possible indicator of a less than pure past, even if the Crimson Thread test had supposedly cleared her. The experience of passing the test, Agnes realized, did not grant her freedom. It merely placed her on a different rung of the societal ladder, one still precarious and subject to constant surveillance. The fear of accusation was replaced by the fear of scrutiny, the dread of a misstep that could unravel everything. She found herself censoring her laughter, moderating her opinions, and constantly striving to embody an unattainable ideal of demure perfection. The energy expended in maintaining this facade was exhausting, a constant drain on her spirit. She witnessed this subtle ostracism firsthand when she attempted to re engage with her former friends from before her marriage. Some greeted her warmly, their friendships seemingly unaffected, but others, particularly those who had recently married themselves, treated her with a newfound reserve. Their conversations, once open and free flowing, became guarded when Agnes was present. They spoke of their husbands' needs, of the proper management of households, and of the importance of cultivating an unassailable reputation. Agnes sensed their unspoken judgment, their subtle distancing from someone who had, however successfully, been through the crucible of a premarital examination. They seemed to fear that association with her, even if she had passed, might somehow reflect poorly upon them. The psychological toll was immense. Agnes felt as though she were walking a tightrope, with the chasm of societal disapproval gaping beneath her. The knowledge that her entire worth, her respectability, and the security of her marriage rested on a single, imperfect test was a constant burden. It bred a deep-seated insecurity, a feeling of being fundamentally flawed even in her success. She began to doubt her own memories, or her own innocence. Had she been mistaken in her recollections of her wedding night? Had some minute detail been overlooked by Master Alaric or by herself? The shadow of doubt was not just cast by others, it began to fester within her own mind, poisoning her sense of self. This persistent uncertainty was a far more insidious form of torment than the outright condemnation faced by women like Alara. While Alara's ruin was absolute and undeniably public, Agnes was trapped in a gray zone, perpetually on trial. Her cleanness was not a state of grace, but a temporary reprieve, a label that required constant reaffirmation. The societal expectation was not simply to be pure, but to appear to be pure at all times, and to do so without question or fanfare. Any deviation, any hint of the carefree girl she once was immediately interpreted as a sign of something amiss. She saw this in the way other women reacted to her. If she expressed an opinion that was too strong or showed a spark of her former spirited personality, she would be met with raised eyebrows and hushed admonishments from older, more established women of the court. A wife must be gentle, my dear, they would counsel, their words laced with the implicit warning, and above all, she must be unassuming. The implicit message was that her passing the test did not grant her the license to be anything other than a perfectly demure, unremarkable wife. Her very nature, if it strayed too far from this ideal, was in danger of being reinterpreted as a sign of past transgressions. The experience of being subjected to the crimson thread test, even when passed, left an indelible mark on Agnes's psyche. It had taught her that her body, and by extension her entire being, was subject to the judgment of others. It had instilled in her a deep distrust of appearances and a profound awareness of the precariousness of a woman's social standing. The relief of passing was short lived, overshadowed by the ongoing burden of maintaining a flawless facade, a constant performance for an unforgiving audience. The shadow of doubt was a persistent companion, a chilling reminder that in the eyes of society, a woman was never truly beyond reproach, not when her very essence had been laid bare for examination. It was a subtle form of imprisonment, a gilded cage where freedom was a carefully constructed illusion, and where the true verdict was always being silently deliberated. The crimson thread, though it had not condemned her, had undeniably bound her. The societal edifice, so rigidly constructed around the perceived purity of its women, stood in stark, almost brutal contrast to the unencumbered passage of its men, while Agnes and countless others like her navigated a treacherous landscape of scrutiny where every glance, every whisper, every perceived deviation from demure perfection could be interpreted as evidence of past transgression. Men moved through this same world with an almost astonishing immunity. Their honor, their integrity, their very right to societal respect and marital confidence were rarely, if ever, called into question on the grounds of their sexual conduct. This was not merely an oversight, it was a deeply ingrained cultural and religious tenet, a cornerstone of the patriarchal order that underpinned their world. The very notion of male virility was in many ways intrinsically linked to sexual activity. A man's ability to command, to conquer, to sow his seed was celebrated as a sign of strength, of potency, of a healthy God given masculinity. The active pursuit of pleasure, the exploration of one's carnal desires, was not only tolerated, but often seen as a natural expression of this virility. Unlike women, whose sexuality was perceived as a delicate bloom, easily bruised and irrevocably tarnished, male sexuality was viewed as a robust and assertive force, capable of enduring and indeed flourishing amidst a multiplicity of encounters. Religious doctrines, though often espousing universal moral codes, frequently interpreted these codes through a distinctly gendered lens. The procreative imperative, a central theme in many faiths, placed the onus of carrying forth the lineage squarely on the woman's ability to conceive and bear healthy offspring. This meant that a woman's purity, her virginity before marriage, and her fidelity within it was paramount to the legitimacy of the ensuing bloodline. A man's role, while important, was more about the act of insemination than the specific nature or quantity of his previous experiences. His seed, after all, was merely fulfilling its purpose, regardless of how many fields it had previously fertilized. The concept of the unquestioned male was therefore not an accident of history, but a deliberate construction woven into the very fabric of their legal, social, and spiritual frameworks. The cultural narratives reinforced this disparity with unwavering consistency. Tales of heroic knights and noble lords often included dalliances with beautiful maidens, sometimes presented as a testament to their desirability and charm, or even as a necessary outlet for the pressures of their high stakes lives. These affairs were rarely presented as moral failings, but rather as incidental occurrences, the inevitable side effects of a man's elevated status and powerful nature. The same act that could shatter a woman's reputation and her future prospects was often glossed over or even implicitly admired when committed by a man. A man's conquests, spoken of in hushed tones in taverns and in more explicit detail in the private chambers of his peers, were a source of pride, a mark of his desirability and prowess. This exemption extended beyond mere social tolerance. It manifested in a profound lack of accountability. While a woman's sexual history, or even the mere suspicion of it, could lead to her ostracization, ruin, and the annulment of her marriage, a man's past was largely irrelevant to his standing. A nobleman could have engaged in countless affairs, fathered illegitimate children, or sought solace in the arms of courtesans, yet still be considered a suitable husband, a respected patriarch, and an honorable member of society. His worth was measured by his lineage, his wealth, his martial skill, and his political acumen, never by the fidelity of his past or present sexual conduct. The implications of this double standard were far reaching. For men, it meant a freedom of movement, both physically and socially, that women could only dream of. They were not bound by the same anxieties or the constant need to self monitor their behavior to avoid potential scandal. They could engage in relationships, explore their desires, and forge connections without the specter of judgment hanging over their heads. This freedom was not simply about sexual license, so it was about a fundamental difference in how their humanity was perceived and valued. Men were seen as complex beings with needs and desires that extended beyond their roles as husbands or fathers, while women were, in essence, defined by their reproductive capacity and their sexual purity. This inherent sexism, baked into the very foundations of their society, meant that men moved through the world unburdened. They did not have to endure invasive physical examinations, nor did they face public scrutiny over their sexual past. Their honor was not contingent on proving their virginity or their fidelity. It was assumed, an intrinsic quality that accompanied their maleness. This cultural assumption allowed them to ascend the social and political ladders with a singular focus, unhindered by the emotional and psychological toll that constant judgment inflicted upon women. Their identity was not fragile, dependent on the maintenance of a carefully curated image of purity. Instead, it was robust, built on a foundation of assumed inherent worth. Consider the stark contrast in the legal spheres. While laws were enacted to punish women for adultery and to control their sexual behavior, men faced far fewer, if any, legal repercussions for similar offenses. The very definition of adultery often excluded male infidelity, focusing solely on the woman's transgression. This legal framework served to solidify the societal belief that a man's sexual activity was a private matter, while a woman's was a matter of public concern, directly impacting lineage and social order. The unquestioned male was, in essence, a legal construct as much as a social one, protected by a system that prioritized male prerogative and patriarchal stability. The cultural narratives also played a crucial role in shaping perceptions. Epics and historical accounts often lionized men for their martial prowess, their leadership, and their intellectual achievements, with their personal lives and romantic entanglements often serving as mere footnotes, if mentioned at all. When women were featured in these narratives, their worth was almost invariably tied to their beauty, their virtue, and their relationship to prominent men. This societal storytelling reinforced the idea that male identity was self contained and independent, while female identity was derivative, defined by their connections to men and their adherence to prescribed roles. Even in matters of love and marriage, the expectation differed dramatically. A man was permitted, even encouraged, to sow his wild oats before settling down, to gain experience and understanding of the world before committing to a wife. This period of exploration was seen as a vital part of his development. For a woman, however, any deviation from a path of pure, chaste adolescence was considered a grave error, an unforgivable lapse that could taint her eligibility and her family's honor for generations. The experience that was lauded in men was seen as a dangerous corruption in women. The absence of this pervasive scrutiny meant that men's emotional and psychological energy was not consumed by the constant performance of purity. They could afford to be, or at least appear to be, more genuine, more direct, and less concerned with the intricate dance of social navigation that consumed women's lives. Their focus could remain on ambition, on power, on the accumulation of wealth and influence, without the ever present fear of a single misstep leading to social ostracization or marital dissolution. This freed them to engage with the world more assertively, to take risks, and to pursue their goals with a singular, unadulterated drive. The unquestioned male was therefore not simply a fortunate accident of birth, but the direct product of a deeply ingrained societal and religious ideology that placed a vastly different value on male and female sexuality. This ideology dictated that male sexual expression was a sign of strength and vitality, while female sexual expression, or even the potential for it, was a source of constant danger and suspicion. It created a world where men could move through life with a remarkable degree of freedom, their honor and respectability largely unassailable, while women were forever bound by the need to prove their purity, their worth, and their adherence to an often impossible ideal. The echoes of this imbalance resonated through every aspect of their lives, shaping destinies and perpetuating a system of profound inequality. The meticulously constructed world Agnes inhabited, and indeed all women of her era, was one where agency, The very essence of self determination was a luxury rarely afforded and often entirely denied. This was not a matter of individual misfortune or the occasional cruel twist of fate. It was a pervasive, systemic erosion of a woman's control over her own existence, particularly as it pertained to her body, her reputation, and consequently, her future. The summary states that a woman's agency was lost, and to truly grasp the weight of this loss, one must delve into the granular details of how this powerlessness was woven into the fabric of their lives. Consider for a moment the profound disconnect between the internal reality of a woman and the external pronouncements made about her. While Agnes might have felt a flicker of affection, a moment of shared understanding, or even a genuine, albeit forbidden, connection with someone other than her intended spouse, the prevailing societal and religious framework offered no space for such nuanced human experience. Her emotions, her desires, her very capacity for independent thought regarding matters of the heart were rendered secondary, even irrelevant, to the predetermined narrative of her sexual purity. The external judgment, often rendered by individuals who had never shared a word with her, never witnessed her kindness or her intellect, was the sole arbiter of her worth. This judgment, based on the flimsiest of evidence or, more often, on mere suspicion, possessed the chilling power to dictate the trajectory of her entire life. The systemic nature of this loss of agency is perhaps best understood by examining the mechanisms through which it was enforced. The control exerted over a woman's body was absolute, extending from the moment of her birth to the ultimate judgment of her post mortem reputation. Her virginity, a state of physical integrity that was both a commodity and a shield, was guarded with ferocious intensity. This guarding, however, was not a matter of her own volition. It was an external imposition, a responsibility placed upon her by a society that saw her body not as her own, but as a vessel for lineage and a symbol of family honor. Any perceived transgression, any smudge upon this pristine exterior, was seen as a betrayal not just of personal morality, but of a collective communal ideal. The hymen, a mere physical barrier, became a fortress, and its breaching, whether through consensual act or violent violation, could lead to the same devastating consequences: ruin, ostracization, and a future that was effectively nullified. This societal obsession with female purity meant that a woman's reputation, a far more fragile construct than a man's, was constantly under siege. Unlike men, whose reputations were largely built on deeds, accomplishments, and the accumulation of power, a woman's reputation was precariously balanced on the needlepoint of her sexual history. A single whispered rumor, a jealous accusation, or even an innocent interaction misinterpreted through the lens of suspicion could unravel years of virtuous living in an instant. There were no robust legal protections against slander that specifically targeted a woman's perceived sexual indiscretions. Instead, the law, and more importantly, public opinion, acted as an accelerant, readily accepting and disseminating any accusation that cast doubt on a woman's chastity. This created a perpetual state of anxiety, a need for constant vigilance, and an awareness that her entire social standing could be annihilated by the words of others. The impact of this erosion of agency was profound and far reaching. It meant that a woman's choices were severely circumscribed. Marriage, the primary avenue for social and economic stability for most women, was not a matter of mutual choice and affection, but a transaction, often arranged by families, where her purity was the primary bargaining chip. If her reputation was tarnished, her marketability plummeted, leaving her with fewer options, or worse, no options at all. She could be deemed unsuitable for a respectable marriage, relegated to a less desirable match, or in the most extreme cases, condemned to a life of poverty and dependence. This was not a reflection of her character or her capabilities, but a direct consequence of external judgments about her sexual history. Furthermore, the very notion of a woman's will or desire was systematically suppressed. If a woman dared to express an opinion on her own behalf, particularly in matters of relationships or marriage, she risked being labeled as headstrong, impudent, or worse. Her true desires were expected to align with the dictates of her family and the prevailing social norms. To deviate was to invite censure. This created a profound internal conflict, where women were often forced to internalize societal expectations, to perform a version of themselves that was acceptable, while their true selves, their authentic feelings, were buried deep within. This suppression of the inner self was a significant aspect of the lost agency, as it denied women the right to self discovery and authentic expression. The legal framework, or the lack thereof, further cemented this loss of agency. While men might have faced consequences for actions that damaged their family's honor, these were typically related to property, debt, or outright rebellion, rather than their personal sexual conduct. For women, however, adultery, or even the suspicion of it, could have severe legal ramifications. In some jurisdictions, a married woman found guilty of adultery could face imprisonment or even more severe punishments. Her husband, on the other hand, could engage in extramarital affairs with relative impunity. This stark legal disparity underscored the societal belief that a woman's sexuality was a communal concern, a public matter that directly impacted the legitimacy of heirs and the stability of the social order, while a man's was a private affair, his prerogative. The consequences of this lack of agency extended to the very understanding of a woman's personhood. Women were often viewed not as complete individuals with their own thoughts, feelings, and aspirations, but as extensions of their fathers, husbands, or sons. Their identity was derived, contingent on their relationship to men and their adherence to prescribed roles. This meant that any perceived failing in their adherence to these roles, particularly in relation to sexuality, was seen as a failure of the entire patriarchal structure. The societal response was therefore not one of gentle correction, but of decisive, often brutal, reaffirmation of control. The absence of recourse was another critical element of this lost agency. If a woman was wrongly accused, if her reputation was unjustly damaged, she had very limited avenues for redress. The burden of proof often fell upon her to demonstrate her innocence, a virtually impossible task when the accusations were based on rumor or innuendo. The very process of defending oneself could further entrench the stigma, as it required delving into the very aspects of her life that society deemed most shameful. The courts, if they considered such matters at all, were heavily biased towards upholding the patriarchal order, and a woman's testimony against a man, particularly on matters of sexual conduct, carried little weight. This systemic disempowerment meant that women were perpetually on the defensive. Their lives were a constant negotiation with external forces, a strategic maneuvering to avoid censure and to secure a semblance of stability. This mental and emotional toll was immense, diverting energy and focus away from personal growth, intellectual pursuits, or the development of individual talents. The very act of navigating this treacherous social landscape required a constant awareness of one's surroundings, a meticulous self monitoring of words, actions, and even expressions. It was a life lived under a magnifying glass, where every detail was subject to scrutiny and potential condemnation. The impact on marriage itself was also deeply detrimental to female agency. While a man entered marriage with the expectation of companionship and procreation, his personal freedom was largely untethered. A woman, on the other hand, entered marriage as a subject, her fidelity a legal and social imperative. The power imbalance was inherent, and the consequences of her deviation were far more severe. This meant that the marital bond, rather than being a partnership of equals, was often a cage for the woman, where her primary role was to maintain the purity of the lineage and the sanctity of the hearth, while her husband enjoyed freedoms that were unthinkable for her. The very language used to describe women's sexuality was indicative of this lost agency. Terms like defiled, tainted, and ruined were applied liberally, suggesting an irreversible corruption that could occur from a single transgression. This was in stark contrast to the language used for men, where terms like conquest and experience were employed, implying a more robust and less vulnerable nature. This linguistic framing reinforced the idea that women's sexuality was inherently dangerous and easily damaged, thus justifying the extreme measures taken to control it and the severe consequences for any perceived lapse. In essence, the medieval woman's existence was often defined by the limitations imposed upon her, rather than by her own aspirations or achievements. Her body was a public concern, her reputation a fragile commodity, and her future a landscape dictated by the judgments of others. The loss of agency was not a singular event, but a continuous, pervasive experience that permeated every aspect of her life, from her personal relationships to her economic survival and her very sense of self. It was a profound silencing, a denial of the right to self determination, and a testament to a society that prioritized patriarchal control over individual liberty, particularly for its female subjects. The echoes of this lost agency resonated not only through the lives of women like Agnes, but through the very structure of the society they inhabited, shaping its norms, its laws, and its enduring legacy. This pervasive control meant that even in moments of personal joy or deep connection, the underlying current of potential judgment and the constant need for vigilance remained, a stark reminder of the limited space a woman truly occupied in her own world. The historical shadow of medieval scrutiny, particularly concerning female virginity and sexual purity, does not vanish simply because the explicit rituals of examination have receded into the annals of history, while the overt, physical examination of a woman's body to ascertain her sexual past is a practice confined to the medieval era. The underlying societal anxieties and the relentless judgment that fueled such practices continue to manifest in subtler, yet no less impactful ways in the modern world. We must tread carefully here, for the intention is not to equate the profound injustices and systemic oppression of the past with the challenges women face today. The medieval landscape, with its often brutal enforcement of sexual norms and its tangible consequences, was a world apart. Yet to understand the enduring echoes, we must acknowledge the subtle, persistent whispers of those past attitudes that can still shape contemporary experiences. The digital age, with its ubiquitous platforms and instantaneous dissemination of information, has paradoxically created new arenas for the age old scrutiny of female sexuality. While the medieval judge or village elder wielded the power to pronounce a woman's ruin through whispers and pronouncements, today's digital spaces can amplify rumor and judgment to an unimaginable scale. Online forums, social media, and even the comment sections beneath articles can become virtual pillories where a woman's perceived sexual history or choices are dissected, debated, and condemned with alarming alacrity. The virginity testing of old may be obsolete, but the impulse to police women's sexuality, to measure their worth against a rigid standard of sexual purity, finds fertile ground in the curated realities and public performances of online life. A woman's online persona, her clothing choices and photographs, her associations, or even the language she uses can be weaponized, twisted into evidence of promiscuity or moral failing, regardless of the truth. This is not a direct parallel to the physical examinations of the past, but it reflects a continuity in the societal impulse to control and categorize female sexuality, shifting the battleground from the physical realm to the digital. Consider the modern phenomenon of slut shaming. While the term itself is relatively new, the underlying sentiment, the denigration of women for perceived sexual promiscuity, or even for expressing their sexuality openly, is an echo of medieval condemnation. Where a medieval woman might be ostracized for the merest hint of impropriety, a modern woman can face torrents of online abuse, reputational damage, and social exclusion for actions that are often considered acceptable or even celebrated in men. The double standard persists, a silent inheritance from an era that saw female sexuality as inherently dangerous and needing strict containment. This public shaming, amplified by the speed and reach of digital communication, can have devastating consequences for a woman's mental well being, her career prospects, and her sense of safety. It's a modern manifestation of the medieval fear that a woman's sexual purity was a fragile commodity, easily tarnished and eternally damaging. Furthermore, the persistent focus on a woman's sexual history in certain contexts, even outside the digital sphere, can feel like a spectral remnant of medieval concerns. In some professional settings, in matters of personal relationships, or even in casual social interactions, a woman may find her past sexual experiences subjected to a level of scrutiny that her male counterparts rarely, if ever, face. This scrutiny isn't always overt, it can be subtle, manifesting as a raised eyebrow, a loaded question, or a shift in perceived trustworthiness. While not equivalent to the medieval trials of chastity, these instances reveal an underlying discomfort with female sexual autonomy and a lingering tendency to judge women based on their sexual lives, rather than their character, skills, or accomplishments. The expectation that women should maintain a certain sexual cleanliness to be deemed respectable or worthy, though often unstated, continues to influence perceptions and opportunities. The anxieties surrounding female fertility and reproductive choices, though rooted in different historical and biological contexts, also carry faint echoes of the medieval concern for lineage and the control of reproduction. In the medieval period, a woman's virginity and later her marital fidelity were crucial for ensuring legitimate heirs and maintaining property lines. While modern societies grapple with reproductive rights and access to contraception and abortion in vastly different ways, the intense public debate and the moralizing that often accompany discussions of female sexuality and reproductive agency can feel like a continuation of that older impulse to control women's bodies and their reproductive capacities. The very notion that a woman's reproductive choices are a matter of public concern, subject to political and religious debate, hints at a historical lineage where women's bodies were not entirely their own, but were intrinsically linked to the social order and the perpetuation of families and communities. The concept of a woman's reputation in the modern era, while often built on a wider array of factors than in medieval times, can still be disproportionately vulnerable to sexual judgment. While a man's reputation might hinge on his professional achievements or his business acumen, a woman's can still be significantly and unfairly impacted by perceptions of her sexual conduct. A rumor, a misconstrued interaction, or a past relationship, even if consensual and private, can become a focal point of gossip and judgment, potentially undermining her standing in ways that a man in a similar situation would not experience. This fragility of reputation, tethered to sexual propriety, is a particularly persistent echo of the medieval era, where a woman's social survival often depended on an unimpeachable and narrowly defined sexual history. It is crucial to reiterate that these are not direct equivalences, but rather subtle continuities in societal attitudes. The medieval era possessed no concept of consent as understood today, and its legal and social structures were designed to enforce patriarchal control with a severity that modern discourse, at its best, seeks to dismantle. The physical invasiveness and the sheer lack of recourse for medieval women stand in stark contrast to many contemporary realities. However, the underlying biases, the tendency to view female sexuality through a lens of suspicion, the impulse to police women's behavior based on their perceived sexual choices, and the persistent double standard applied to male and female sexuality are threads that connect the past to the present. Recognizing these echoes is not about claiming that modern women are subjected to the same horrors as their medieval forebears, but rather about understanding how deeply ingrained certain societal attitudes can be and how they can resurface in new forms, subtly influencing perceptions and perpetuating inequalities even in a seemingly transformed world. The scrutiny may be less physical, the judgment delivered through different channels, but the underlying pressure on women to conform to particular standards of sexual conduct remains a discernible, albeit often unspoken, part of the social landscape. This ongoing societal dialogue, this complex interplay between progress and the persistence of old biases, is vital to understand as we continue to explore the evolving landscape of gender and societal expectations. The shadows of medieval scrutiny, while not casting the same impenetrable darkness, still flicker, reminding us of the long and ongoing journey towards genuine equality and autonomy for women. The meticulous and often deeply disturbing rituals of medieval virginity testing, once a grim reality for countless women, ultimately served a singular, potent purpose: the exertion of control over female sexuality. These were not simply peculiar historical footnotes or the eccentricities of a bygone era. They were sophisticated mechanisms, honed by centuries of patriarchal tradition designed to regulate women's bodies, their social standing, and ultimately the very fabric of societal order. The elaborate, often invasive examinations were less about biological discovery and more about the reinforcement of power dynamics. They were a tangible manifestation of a society that viewed female sexuality with suspicion, bordering on outright fear, and sought to contain it within rigidly defined boundaries. At its core, the medieval obsession with virginity, and by extension, female sexual purity, was a deeply political and economic concern. For the aristocracy and landed gentry, the integrity of bloodlines was paramount, ensuring that heirs were legitimate, that property passed down through the correct lineage was a matter of dynastic survival. A woman's virginity before marriage was the primary, and often only, guarantee of her fidelity within marriage, and thus the legitimacy of her offspring. Her sexual history, or perceived history, was therefore not a private matter, but a public concern, directly impacting inheritance, alliances, and the stability of the social hierarchy. The virginity tests, in their varied and often crude forms, were the crude instruments wielded to uphold these principles. They were a way of policing women's bodies to ensure the purity of the patrilineal line. Beyond the aristocratic concerns of lineage, the same principles of control permeated society at all levels. For the peasant or the merchant class, a daughter's virginity before marriage was still a significant asset, reflecting well on the family's honor and its ability to secure a good match. A married woman's fidelity ensured that the fruits of her husband's labor were passed to his own children, not those of another man. Thus, the anxieties surrounding female sexuality were not confined to castles and courts. They permeated the village green, the marketplace, and the home. The virginity tests, when performed, whether by a midwife, a physician, or even in some imagined legalistic context, were a public affirmation of these societal values. They served as a stark reminder to women of the immense importance placed upon their sexual conduct and the severe consequences of deviation. The very existence of such practices and the societal acceptance they garnered speaks volumes about the ingrained nature of patriarchal authority. These tests, often humiliating and physically uncomfortable, were normalized, accepted as a necessary, albeit unpleasant, part of ensuring social order and familial continuity. The fact that women were subjected to such scrutiny and that their worth was so intrinsically tied to their sexual past highlights the extent to which their autonomy and agency were curtailed. Their bodies were not their own. They were viewed as conduits for lineage, as repositories of honor, and as potential sources of disruption if not tightly managed. The uncomfortable truth is that these rituals, in their starkness, reveal the sheer depth of a societal need to control female sexuality. This wasn't merely about morality in an abstract sense, it was about tangible power. The control of women's sexual and reproductive capacities was a cornerstone of patriarchal dominance, underpinning social structures, legal frameworks, and economic arrangements for centuries. Virginity testing, in its most overt and physical form, was one of the most brutal and unambiguous expressions of this pervasive need. It stripped women of their bodily integrity and reduced their value to a singular biological marker. The historical narrative of virginity testing, therefore, is not just a chronicle of peculiar medical practices or legal curiosities. It is a testament to the enduring power of societal anxieties about female sexuality and the lengths to which patriarchal structures would go to contain it. While the explicit physical examination of a woman's body for virginity may be a relic of the past, the underlying impulse, the desire to police, to judge, and to control female sexual expression, continues to echo, albeit in different forms, through contemporary society. Understanding the raw truth of these medieval practices compels us to reflect on the progress made, but also to acknowledge the persistent shadows of those deeply ingrained attitudes. The uncomfortable truth is that the roots of these controls run deep, and their legacy, however altered, is still a part of our collective consciousness, shaping expectations and influencing perceptions of women and their sexuality to this very day. The question remains, as we move forward, how deeply have we truly uprooted these ancient anxieties, or have they merely found new soil in which to grow, adapting their form but not their fundamental intent? The echoes are undeniable, and confronting them is essential to understanding the ongoing journey towards a genuine sexual autonomy and equality for women. The medieval era sought to lock away female sexuality, defining it as something inherently dangerous, something to be managed and contained for the preservations of male lineage and social order. The stark reality of virginity testing was the ultimate physical embodiment of that desire. It was the blunt instrument used to enforce an ideology that valued women not for themselves, but for their capacity to fulfill specific gendered roles, primarily those of wife and mother, defined strictly through the lens of sexual purity. This historical reality forces us to ask a difficult question. How much of that ancient ideology, that ingrained suspicion and desire for control, has truly been left behind, and how much still lingers, subtly shaping our present? The journey from the medieval examination room to the 21st century discourse on consent and bodily autonomy has been long and arduous, marked by struggle and incremental progress. Yet the uncomfortable truth is that the desire to regulate women's sexuality is a persistent force, adapting its methods but rarely its underlying aim. The very intensity of the medieval focus on virginity was a symptom of a deeper societal malaise, a profound discomfort with female agency, with the idea that women might possess sexual desires or exercise sexual choices independent of male approval or oversight. The tests were a desperate attempt to assert control in the face of an imagined threat. The uncontrolled female body, the unpredictable nature of female desire. They were a declaration that a woman's worth, her social standing, and her very identity were inextricably linked to a singular and often externally imposed standard of sexual purity. This was not about inherent morality, but about the maintenance of a power structure. The historical record, in its unflinching depiction of these practices, offers a stark and uncomfortable glimpse into the mechanisms of patriarchal control, revealing a truth that we cannot afford to ignore. The past, in its most visceral forms, continues to inform the present, urging us to remain vigilant in our pursuit of a society where women's bodies and their sexual autonomy are truly their own.